positive, but there's been a real shift in the past few years. To dig a little bit deeper, we asked a follow-up question around why residents feel the quality of life has improved or worsened. And you can see this is an open-ended question, so they're not prompted in the responses. So the top 5 reasons why quality of life has improved really point to a variety of different things, but it's more activities, things to do, economic development, good amenities, services, city leadership and governance, and improved downtown. So those are the top 5 reasons why residents feel the quality of life has improved. Do use some caution when interpreting those results, just because it is based on a relatively small sample size, but it does give a sense and flavor for kind of the things driving those improved impressions. Conversely, when we look at the reasons why quality of life has worsened, there's 2 main things that stand out, and that's COVID-19 and the cost of living. No real surprise to see this here. The pandemic has certainly impacted many different areas of life, so it's not surprising to see it come up as the #1 reason why residents feel the quality of life has worsened. And the same with the cost of living and inflation. We've seen that come up more and more in the studies that we're doing, that this is kind of a factor affecting people across the country. Municipal government services, particularly utilities costs, social issues, and the economy lead the public issue agenda. So this was actually one of the first questions in the survey. It's an open-ended question where we ask residents what they feel are the most important issues facing the community. That is those issues they really want their local leaders to address. So as you can see, the top 3 mentions are municipal government services, social issues, and the economy. As to what's included in each of these, municipal government services is primarily comprised of mentions related to utility costs, but it also includes things like infrastructure, city cleanliness, garbage recycling, and just mentions of other municipal government services. If you look at how this compares to the norm, mentions of municipal government services in Medicine Hat are double what we typically see. I suspect this is because the city owns its utilities where the municipalities included in the norm would not, and that's kind of why we're seeing more of an emphasis put on it here than we typically see. Social issues at 20% includes a variety of things, like top mentions would be drugs, poverty, homelessness, housing, affordable housing, seniors issues, and then other social mentions. I think it's noteworthy, while social issues are the top 2 issue in Medicine Hat, it's still not quite to the extent that we typically see this is the #1 issue in the norm. And when we look at the normative results, really the focus primarily tends to be on housing and affordable housing. There's other issues mixed up in there as well, certainly some poverty and homelessness, but really those are the 2 issues driving it with the norm, where we see kind of a variety of things when we're looking at Medicine Hat. Rounding out the top 3 is the economy at 17%. That includes mentions around cost of living, economic development, employment, jobs, and other economy mentions. It is higher than the norm. The norm is at 7%. So while it doesn't typically come up as a local issue, I can see we do see this come up more and more kind of nationally when we're looking at important issues facing the country. Economy, inflation, interest rates, all those things are a growing concern. Okay, key finding #4, communication with residents could be improved, and there's a few things to speak to here. One of the main objectives of the survey was to understand how important services are to residents, and then how satisfied residents are with these specific services. So we looked at a number of different services, of which one of them was communication with residents. And as you can see, 90% of residents say the city communication with them is important. In comparison, fewer, 76% say they're satisfied with the city's communication with residents. So while that 76% is still a solid majority overall and indicates that by and large the city is doing a good job in this regard as a whole, it is comparatively lower than what we're seeing for most of the other evaluated services. It is also a little bit lower than the norm, and just given how important this service is to citizens, it indicates there is room for improvement. Moreover, when we look at perceptions of the city's performance in other areas, we see comparatively lower scores, again, for those items related to public engagement. So, for example, 69% agree that the city uses input from citizens in decision-making about city's projects and services, and 67% agree that the city provides citizens with opportunities to have meaningful input into decision-making. So again, 2/3 of residents are satisfied in this regard, doing a good job overall, but the comparatively lower scores does indicate there is room for some improvement in this regard. On a high note, satisfaction with the city's customer service is high. We have 43% of residents saying they personally contacted or dealt with the City of Medicine Hat or one of its employees in the past 12 months. This is a little bit lower than the norm, which is at 50%, but I suspect we're seeing some COVID-related indicators coming in here with maybe services not fully up and running, or maybe some residents choosing to stay home just because of social distancing. So we may see this measure come up the next survey. But among those who contacted or dealt with the city, satisfaction with the city's customer service is high. We have 85% of residents saying they're satisfied with the overall service they received. And when we look at different service elements, staff courteousness is one that stands out as a service highlight, with 95% saying they're satisfied in that regard, and nearly 3/4 saying they're very satisfied. Satisfaction with the other elements of customer service is also high, whether we're looking at helpfulness, knowledge, the speed and timeliness of service, the ease of reaching staff, or ability to resolve your issue, all receive strong satisfaction scores overall and are all comparable to the norm. And then lastly, opinion is split on balancing taxation and service delivery levels. So one of the questions was around if citizens had to choose, would they prefer the city to increase taxes or cut services? And we recognize this is a choice nobody really wants to make, but sometimes difficult decisions have to be made. And we wanted to get a sense of what way do citizens want the city to go. So you can see there's no clear preference one way or the other. We have 45% saying increase taxes and 42% saying cut services. And this is unlike the norm, where there tends to be that clear preference for a tax increase over service cuts. We're not seeing that in Medicine Hat. It's a little bit more split, indicating that no matter which decision the city goes, there's going to be a proportion of residents who feel that's the wrong decision. So that wraps up the presentation. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. If I can figure out how to do this, pull this up. But I'm happy to pull it up if anyone has any questions or would like to go over anything.
Thank you very much. I'll give a moment if anyone has a question they want to ask. Councillor Dubanowski.
Your Worship, thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Not sure how you pronounce your last name. Knaus? Knaus, pardon me. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I will say at my first observation, especially with the highlights at the onset, are very favorable. And I'm not saying that because I sit around the council table and that bodes well for this council, although it does speak to governance in here. I'm overall pleased because we are in a challenging time, although there's lots of reason to be optimistic, and we are making our way through many of the challenges. There is a lot of concern out there, and to identify our community identify with an overall quality of life favorable percentage of 95 is extraordinary. I would have never actually thought any community could hit that. I mean that genuinely. So it is interesting going through the survey when there's a reference to the norm where we lie. But overall, I'm happy to hear, I guess in general, that the public is overall quite happy with their community, their services, their value for tax dollars, and even so much as to say 91% would recommend Medicine Hat as a place to live, and of course I would agree wholeheartedly with that. The online portion, I guess I'm going to ask a question that you kind of touched on. You said it was kind of taken separately and dealt with separately, and there's lots of reasons and rationale for that. But do you find, or do you expect that there will be people who would say that I wasn't contacted, but I lended my voice to the data in the form of online, but it's kind of not discounted, but it's certainly not accounted for in the same way. What's the, I mean, other than the obvious reasons for that, and I think most people will understand that, are there means to do these kinds of surveys that aren't always going to require a contact face-to-face, if you will, or on the phone, both landline or mobile, in order to get this, derive certain kinds of responses from the public? Because I know in the past when we do other surveys, many other surveys, we've done both, but we've done a lot of online, and you have to take those a little bit with a grain of salt. But without getting too long-winded, which I already have, can you tell me what your thought is around an online version and kind of the public's belief that their opinion is discounted because of that versus being called as one of the 400?
Yeah, I don't think the online opinions are discounted in any way. It's just they're two different methodologies, and because of that, we cannot combine them. There is that randomness, and one is non-random, and so doing that is really just not a good survey practice. So I think it is important to look at the results as a whole when going through them. And even though I didn't speak to the online results during this presentation, I can share that they are very similar to the telephone survey results. We see a lot of the same general themes and sentiments come out. The online results tend to be a little bit lower than the telephone survey results, but that's not unusual. We typically do see that when we do these kind of telephone online surveys. So overall, I think the sentiments are the same, but maybe a little bit less positive than telephone. So for example, like I don't have the exact numbers in front of me right now, but if 95% of respondents for the telephone survey rate the overall quality of life, that might be kind of 85% with the online. So it's still good, just a little bit lower. And I think you'll see that as you go through. So I think just in summary, it's important to look at everything as a whole, but there's nothing that really stands out in the online as being dramatically different from the telephone. Just
supplementary. Thank you for that. The other observation is the key finding number 4 on page 15 of the slide. Citizens feeling their input is heard or understood when it comes to decision making on a local level. I do see that we are very close to the norm, so I would have actually, if I would have had to have guessed, I would have probably guessed this range. You did, though, however, indicate or generalize that the 3-year trend is kind of becoming, or is lessening or becoming more negative. I don't know what words you use, sorry, but I do want to just speak to that quickly. I know our community-facing kind of platform that we're really working hard to engage with the public on should hopefully counter that. That's my hope. Do you have any, I don't know if you give advice other than you crunch the numbers and then spit them out for us, but do you have any observations from other communities or ones that you formed through this kind of analysis that help counter those kinds of trends? Yeah. I think with this one, when it comes to kind of public engagement and communications, you are very similar to the norm in this regard. But in the report, we did just add a little bit of more language around kind of some suggestions for improving some of this. Its opportunities. It's not a communications related survey, so we didn't dig too deep. But really, when it comes to public engagement, in my experience, it's about making sure those opportunities are available, but also closing the loop with people. So once the engagement is done, kind of sharing the output of what was what was told to the city by citizens, as well as kind of informing people around, and this can be both upfront as well as kind of in the conclusion, but informing people kind of what other factors besides public input are going to be shaping decisions, because sometimes they're going to be city decisions that run counter to the public input that was received. So it's important that people know that the input is one piece of it, and so there's other factors involved. And I think if that's shared kind of upfront as well as when sharing the findings of the output and the decisions that were made, it helps bring some clarity to the decisions that the city is making and maybe makes it a little bit more transparent for people. Thank you.
Councillor Knodel.
Thanks, Mayor Clark. Thank you for the work that you've done on behalf of the team that you work with, and as a fellow not silent KN last name person. Yeah, just wanted to announce that. So I'm just curious. So my first question is more about the psychology behind the lower ratings online. And for the average community member who may feel like, oh, that can't be possible that that many people are satisfied or happy with the community, what really drives that that willingness to be a little bit more disgruntled online from your perspective? Again, this is more of a psychology question, but I would assume your team would dialogue about that sort of thing. So maybe just to shine some light on why we might see such a difference.
Yeah. It can be a few different things. Some of it might be speaking with someone versus doing it online. But I think in this particular case, when we're doing these type of parallel online surveys, the people that we randomly contact, like I said, they're just randomly contacted, when we offer the online option, it's people self-selecting whether to take part or not. And usually the people who are then making that additional effort to go online and complete the survey are doing it for a particular reason. So it's either because they're less satisfied about something in particular, or they have a particular issue that they want to speak out about. Usually if people think everything is fine and satisfied, in my experience, they're less inclined to go on and complete that online survey. So I think that's the main reason why we're seeing some of those online results be a little bit lower than the telephone survey results.
Ask a follow-up quick. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then just based on working with several different municipalities, communities, what do you hear from both community members or elected officials about say top 2, top 1 benefits to doing a survey like this? I've got a few in my brain, but I just thought maybe you could share some of your thoughts about what are the most commonly shared benefits.
Yeah, there's a number, but I think it really does give a voice to the silent majority. So you probably hear from people coming out to speak at public meetings or some of the other consultations that you do, but not everyone has the time or the inclination to come out and take part in those things. So doing this kind of random survey really gives a voice to people that the city might not otherwise hear from, and lets you hear, kind of like I said, what that silent majority thinks and is representative of the community as a whole. I also think that doing the surveys on a regular basis, so the intention here is to repeat it every couple of years, really provides valuable insight into kind of how attitudes and priorities might be changing, as well as help you kind of identify any new issues and really provide that monitoring of the city's performance. So it really helps keep track of those issues in the community. If the city makes any changes to the services it provides, or there's really issues that are kind of topical and key issues, this survey picks up on that and lets the city adjust their planning or approach to different issues or services, and helps really clearly identify where there's some needs and opportunities.
Thank you. Great answer. I appreciate the information.
Thank you.
Seeing no further questions, I want to thank you for presenting to us today and for the valuable information that you have provided to the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Your Worship, I'll move reception.
Second.
All right, we will vote on reception of the presentation for information. That's unanimous. Moving on to our second presentation, offsite levy rate update. We have Greg Weiss, President Corvus Business Advisors, and he's going to be attending virtually. And on site, we have Randy Buckner, Superintendent Engineering, and Conrad Westerson, Municipal Engineer 2. Over to you, Randy.
Thank you. Good evening, Your Worship and Council. My name is Randy Buckner. I'm the Superintendent of Engineering with Planning and Development Services. I am joined here today with Conrad Westerson, who is our department's municipal engineer, and also the project manager on the offsite levy review, as well as virtually with Greg Weiss with Corvus Business Advisors, and he is our offsite levy consultant, as well as our offsite levy model provider. I just wanted to kind of frame up the presentation and introduce the concept today. We do have a very exciting presentation on offsite levies. They are a funding mechanism that municipalities utilize to ensure that growth pays for growth. This presentation is a snapshot of the work we have been doing to reintroduce offsite levies and also provide the opportunity for education on them. As background, towards the end of 2020, we started an internal review of the City of Medicine Hat's offsite levy framework. The last update to the City of Medicine Hat's offsite levy framework was completed in 2013. The purpose of this review was to refresh our offsite levies, gain a better understanding of changes we could make to both simplify and align with best practices, as well as align the framework with our 2020 Municipal Development Plan, as well as update in order to align with provincial regulations. Throughout 2021 and into 2022, we began refreshing, updating, and completing the background work to the framework itself. This work has included efforts in collaboration with a multitude of city departments, including planning and development, city assets, finance, our city solicitors, as well as Corvus business advisors. In Greg's presentation today, he will overview what offsite levies are, how we use them, and some of the work that's gone into this. Please note that all of the information is in draft form, and we are just commencing our stakeholder engagement at this time. Last week, we just engaged with our very first stakeholder engagement session. During the session, we walked through the inputs that go into our model, and we will be further following up with the development community in September to hear their feedback and answer their questions. So following that consultation period, we will be seeking to bring forward a formal bylaw amendment to council with a proposed updated framework and rates. This is intended to be brought forward by the end of the year. So with that, I will hand it over to Greg, and he will walk through the presentation.
Thanks, Randy and Mayor Clark, members of council. It's my pleasure to be with you. I guess the first thing I'm going to do is share my my screen with you. I hope you can all see that okay there now. I'll assume that you can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Well, good evening. The topic that we're going to be discussing this evening is a bit of an oddity within municipal governments. It's not a topic that gets a lot of airplay. Councils don't touch this topic very often, and yet the topic tends to represent typically the second most significant financing source for a municipality. As you're going to see a little bit later on in my presentation for the City of Medicine Hat, this particular topic is represents about $150 million of financing. So it's pretty significant and pretty important. As Randy mentioned, staff is just in the process now of engaging developers and other members of the public on the inputs that go into these calculations. But staff asked me if I could start off by presenting taking council through a presentation, provided basically an overview of offsite levies, setting council up for what would be a bylaw update somewhere in the months ahead. So this evening, I'm going to talk about what offsite levies are, how they work, the legislation and regulations that sit behind them, the information that we use to actually calculate rates, the two most important pieces being the land upon which this infrastructure is constructed and is developed, and then the infrastructure itself. And towards the end, I'll provide you using actual, even though this is a generic sort of a presentation, I do want to give you a sense and a flavor for how things sit in your community. And so I'll provide you a sort of a summary of the infrastructure costs and something else we call front ending. And then at the end, again, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. I've done dozens and dozens of these presentations with councils across the province, and I find that typically by the end of them, most of the questions have been answered. So with your permission, what I'd like to do is just ask you to hold your questions to the end. Likely it will be answered some way along the way, but if it's not, I'm here with you for as long as you would like this evening to answer and address your questions. So a little bit about my company, Corvus Business Advisors. We're now operating this year actually is our 20th year. We specialize in municipal financial services. Specifically, we provide annexation, financial impact assessments. We do utility rates for municipalities. And then the topic that we're probably most known for is our work in the area of offsite levy charges. On the offsite levy side alone, our models are now in place and being used by over 45 municipalities across Alberta and Saskatchewan to manage their offsite levy regimes. So what are offsite levies? Well, let's start off by answering that question by understanding a little bit about how the law works in Alberta. The law, being the Municipal Government Act in Alberta, attempts to strike a balance in terms of who pays for what. If we think about new infrastructure, capital costs, those costs are right now in Alberta shared. For the most part, the developer is responsible for picking up the cost associated with what we call hard infrastructure, that being the water, sewer, stormwater, and road-related infrastructure, as well as certain soft infrastructure types, recreation facilities, libraries, police facilities, and the like. Once that infrastructure, that new infrastructure, is paid for by the developer and constructed, it is over to the municipality to operate it for the life of the infrastructure. So that could be 40, 50, 60 years. It's the municipality and the taxpayer that are responsible for paying for the operations and maintenance costs associated with that infrastructure. And then at the end of its life, it's the taxpayer that is also responsible for replacing it. So in this way, in Alberta, as I say, the MGA sort of strikes a balance in terms of who pays for what. You may have heard the old saying that growth pays for growth. Well, as you can see, it's not entirely true. Growth pays for a certain portion of the growth cost, but there are many costs as well that ultimately the municipality and the taxpayer has to bear. When a developer develops a piece of land, there is almost always infrastructure that is constructed on that piece of land that's crucial for its development. Things like the water distribution lines, the local sanitary laterals, the local road network, etc. Developers build and pay for that infrastructure in order to develop the land. And because that infrastructure is located on the land that is being developed, it is generally referred to as on-site infrastructure. But there is also infrastructure that is constructed away from the piece of land being developed that is also crucial for the land's development. Things like the water treatment facility, the sewage treatment facilities, the arterial road network, the recreation facilities. All that infrastructure is not located on the land being developed, and yet it is crucial for the success of the development of that land. Because it's located away from the land being developed, it's referred to as off-site infrastructure. And developers also have a responsibility to pay for their share of that off-site infrastructure. And that's the topic that we'll be talking about this evening. Not on-site infrastructure, but all the infrastructure that's built away from the land that's being developed. There are essentially two ways for a municipality to ensure that a developer pays for their share of offsite infrastructure. The first way is by way of the development agreement, and this 25 years ago is how the vast majority of these kinds of charges were assigned to developers. Every time a developer came into the city, an agreement was negotiated one-on-one with that developer for what they were going to build on site, as well as what they were going to pay for offsite. And as you can well imagine, that was a pretty administratively intensive process, having to do it every time there was a development agreement. And so there is a second mechanism, and over the past 25 years, the vast majority of municipalities have transitioned to this mechanism, and this is to set up a bylaw that outlines and defines what those offsite levy charges are ahead of time. Obviously, this is far less administratively taxing to manage. It's much more transparent. It provides for a level playing field. And it's good for developers too, because they can plan and understand what their costs are going to be long before they actually develop. And there are 2 times the MGA provides you, the municipality, with 2 specific points in time when you can levy an offsite levy charge, either at time of subdivision or at time of development. Those are the only 2 times when an offsite levy can be triggered. And you have to get it right at that time, because you can't go back and retroactively change what charges were in the past. As they say, once the horse is out of the barn, you can't put it back in. If we think about this, square in the center of the slide as a piece of infrastructure, and specifically the cost of a piece of infrastructure, you can see that not all of that cost necessarily will form part of an offsite levy charge. At the top, there could very well be a portion of the infrastructure that benefits the existing citizens. And if that's the case, a portion of that infrastructure's costs will be allocated to the municipality, not to developers, and it will be financed by way of utility rates or taxes or other payment mechanisms. If we think about this block as an arterial road that sits or runs along the boundary of your community, there may be a portion of that arterial road then that benefits the neighboring municipality. And if that's the case, there would be a portion of cost that would be paid for not by developers in your community, but by that neighboring municipality. But by and large, for the most part, new infrastructure of this type is put into the ground or built to help new development. And so often the lion's share of the cost, and this is the grayed out portion in the box, often the lion's share of the cost will find its way to the offsite levy charges. If you're interested in having a look at the MGA, the section that's applicable to offsite levies is section 648. It lays out what you can charge for. As I mentioned earlier, what we're dealing with here is new infrastructure only, not operating costs, not replacement costs, only new infrastructure. And there are 8 infrastructure types that are allowed under the bylaw. The first 3 were established prior to 2004, those being water facilities, sanitary sewer facilities, and stormwater facilities. Then in 2004, the MGA was amended to include road-related infrastructure. And then the most recent amendment to the MGA, which you might recall, was back in 2017, and it enabled the addition of 4 new types of infrastructure. Those are highlighted in red there: recreation facilities, fire halls, police stations, and libraries. Now, just because each of these, all 8 is included in the MGA, does not mean that a municipality needs to include all 8 infrastructure types in its bylaw. In fact, for the vast majority of municipalities in Alberta do not have all 8. Because of the recent changes to the MGA, these latter 4 infrastructure types are only just now slowly, gradually being added to bylaws by certain municipalities across the province. I would suspect that 20 years from now, the vast majority of municipalities will have all of them included. But as for right now, it's a very gradual process, and most municipalities still only focus on the first 3 or 4 types. When you, the municipality, collects an offsite levy from a developer, it can be collected only once. As I said, it is either collected at time of subdivision or at time of development. And you can only collect it once. Even if you were to make an error and, for example, undercharge a developer, you cannot go back and collect again. And those funds that you collect have to be accounted for separately in separate accounts or reserves, if you will. And the reason that they have to be accounted for separately is because they can only be used for the purpose for which they were collected. In other words, the water levies that you collected can only be used to construct the water infrastructure that is outlined in your bylaw. Likewise, the sewer levies can only be used to construct sewer infrastructure, and so on. There are also a set of accompanying regulations that accompany the MGA. They are AR 187-2017. And there are a number of them. I'm not going to read through all of these here, but there are a couple that I do want to highlight. The first that I want to highlight at the top, outlined in green, says there needs to be full disclosure of how the levies, what assumptions are going into the calculation of those levies. And that actually is the process that your staff is going through right now with developers and other members of the community, and engaging them around what those assumptions are, the projects, the cost assumptions, and the like. Whatever those happen to be, all parties that participate in the cost of the infrastructure do so on an equitable basis. And the way that's undertaken is by charging for levies on a net hectare basis. So a developer that develops a larger piece of land will obviously be impacting the infrastructure greater and will pay a greater rate than a developer that is developing a smaller piece of land. The methodology that we use to calculate levies has to be done so consistently across the municipality, but it's important to realize that that doesn't necessarily mean that rates are going to be the same in all areas across the municipality. They typically are not. Each individual area across the municipality will only pay for the infrastructure that actually benefits those areas, and therefore rates are different across the municipality, as you'll see here in a bit. And maybe the most important one, the last one highlighted in green there, and that is that it's important that levies be kept current. There is an update that needs to be done literally annually. The MGA now stipulates that administrations need to provide you, council, with an update on the offsite levy status in your community annually. And the reason that that's important is because we're dealing with big numbers here. And the inputs that go into calculating these things, like master plans and cost estimates, these are forever changing. The changes occur on an ongoing basis. So rates need to be adjusted continually in order to keep pace with these changes. Now, we aren't going to be going into the offsite levy model this evening in any great detail at all, but I at least wanted to give you a glimpse as to what the offsite levy model in your community looks like. This is a snapshot of the control panel for the model that your administration uses to manage offsite levy rates. And you can see in the center there are 8 columns that deal one with each of the infrastructure types allowed under the bylaw. However, for your community, there are only 4 of those 8 that are included in the bylaw, that being road-related infrastructure, water, sewer, and stormwater-related infrastructure. Perhaps somewhere down the line in the future, your community might consider adding the 1 or more of the others, but for the time being, we're dealing with the 4 of the 8. Now, in its most simplest form, an offsite levy is nothing more than a cost divided by the amount of land that is going to pay for that cost. So if we have $10 of cost and we have 2 hectares of land that is paying for it, obviously the charge is $5 per hectare. That's in its simplest form. Now, there are a number of other things that impact rates, but using that as a sort of construct, let's take you through and now show you some of the data that pertains specifically to your community. And I'm going to start with the denominator of the calculation and talk about the land area first. There are 12 offsite levy areas in your community, and this is an update from your current bylaw. One of the things that the City of Medicine Hat did a little differently that was not quite a leading practice was it didn't include all the lands in the community. Well, this time around, your staff have gone to great pains to ensure that all the lands are reflected appropriate in the bylaw. Doesn't mean that every area is charged the same way or even has a rate, but all the lands are reflected so that they could be, if need be, in the future. And there are 12 offsite levy areas, and these areas, for the most part, conform with the boundaries of the benefiting basins of your infrastructure, and in particular, the most important kinds of infrastructure that we have to give consideration to are the sewer and stormwater related infrastructure, because unlike roads, which tend to benefit all areas, sewer and storm related infrastructure are influenced heavily by gravity, and there are only certain lands that benefit. So these areas represent the cross sections. If you were to overlay all of those benefiting basins one on top of the other, you would see them reflected generally in these offsite levy areas. And in those 12 offsite levy areas, there is about 8,700 plus net hectares of land that is available for development. Now I say net hectares because that's how offsite levy areas are charged. They're charged on a net hectare basis. We start with gross area when we are charging a developer, and we remove deductions, things like ER and municipal reserves and any right-of-ways. And we get down to a piece of land that is essentially equal to what a developer can develop on, and that is the net hectare. So there are about 8,700 hectares available, less what has already been developed to date, which is about half of that, 47% of that, leaves in a balance that is going to be developed in the future. And that's an interesting number, but it's really not the number that we need in order to calculate rates. One of the things that you need to understand is that the offsite levy model that we use to calculate rates is underpinned by a 25-year review period. So we look out 25 years and we include in that review period the infrastructure that is going to be built in there, costs, and also the land. So what we really need to understand is how much of the available land is actually forecast to develop over the next 25 years. And to determine that, the planners in your staff just develop something called a development staging plan. The development staging plan looks out 25 years across all 12 of those offsite levy areas and forecasts how much land is going to develop. And they use things like the state of the economy locally, the anticipated growth in population, the number of area structure plans that are in the hopper, their general knowledge of which landowners wish to develop and which do not, et cetera, all the tools that planners use to do their forecasts. Now, one of the things that you might be thinking about, well, gosh, isn't it very difficult to forecast exactly how much land's going to develop in 25 years? And the answer is it's impossible to forecast it 100% accurately. But the other thing you have to remember is this is not a 25-year forecast that stays static. Remember I said that these levy rates are updated every year. So literally every year, this 25-year forecast is redone and looks a little bit further out. So in effect, this is actually really only a one-year forecast before the next update is accomplished. Anyways, as it relates specifically to your community, you can see that there are about 640 hectares roughly of land that your planners anticipate to develop over the next 25 years. And by the way, compared to the estimates in your current bylaw, that's an increase of about 12% from the last time this was done in your community a number of years back. And of course, if we increase the land in the denominator, any number in a denominator that's increased, we can expect then what that will do is it will bring down the overall rate, all other things remaining equal. Well, that is a general discussion of the denominator, the land. Let's now talk about the numerator, or the costs. Now, you have 4 infrastructure types, and I'm not going to go through all 4 of those tonight. We don't have the time for that. But I did want to use transportation as the example, if you will, to show you how the costs are assembled. They work exactly the same way for the other infrastructure types. The only thing that changes is the projects themselves and the cost estimates, but how the costs come together is exactly the same. So in your community, in your city, there are 23 transportation-related off-site infrastructure projects, and these 23 projects have a total of nearly $185 million. And that $185 million is comprised of 3 parts. In the first column is the cost of all the work that has been done up to this point in time. Secondly, if there were any financing charges, the interest associated with those financing would also be added in here. And lastly, it's the costs associated with the work that's going to be done in the future, which is essentially the capital plan, if you will, the transportation master plan or capital plan. And when you bring those three elements together, as I say, in your city, there's about $185 million of transportation-related infrastructure that we think about as it relates to the offsite levy. Now, before we start allocating these costs, we have to subtract or give credit for any portion of cost that is being borne by other parties. So if the provincial government, for example, is providing a special earmarked grant, we would deduct that from the cost. If there are any other contributions and the like, we would deduct them. As you can see here, the city has not received, nor is it planning to receive, any of the special grants or contributions. So the total remains around $185 million. Those special earmark grants that we typically would see from the province are prioritized, firstly, for water treatment facilities across the province. Secondly, would be sewage treatment facilities. And the third priority, typically for the province, is a water-related capacity project, so water reservoirs. There isn't a lot that we see on this side, and unless they happen to be large interchanges and the like. So that $185 million, we're now ready to allocate to parties that benefit. And there are three parties that we have to concern ourselves with. The first party, and this is in the first column here, is there any of these projects for which existing citizens in the community will receive a benefit? And as you can see, your staff have estimated that there's a significant portion that of these projects that your existing citizens are going to benefit from, generally about 79%. Secondly, are there any other neighboring municipalities that would be paying for any of this infrastructure? And that's not the case for any of these specific projects. But if there were, the engineers would have identified it in this second column. And then lastly, the last two columns together form the share of the project for which future development is going to bear a cost. Those are the last two columns together. The difference between the last two columns is a portion of we want to separate those costs into two pieces. That portion that falls within our 25-year review period, that's the very last one, and that's the piece that we're using to generate rates. And if there is a portion that falls beyond our 25-year review period, that's in the second last column, that is parsed out, and that is not included in rates today. Now, that 25-year review period does not stay static. Every year when an update is done, it looks 1 year further out and 1 year further out after that, and so on. So eventually, all of this percentage in this third column will generally find its way into rates at some point in the future, but it's not in there today. And how do we calculate that portion of cost that is beyond our 25-year review period? Well, we prorate it. It's pretty straightforward. We prorate the cost based on the year that the project is going to be built. So if you look along the timeline on the bottom of the slide, and let's start at the far right first, you can see example 4. Example 4 sits beyond our 25-year review period, and so 0% of those costs would be in our rates. Moving back to example 3, if this project was being built in year 20 of 25, that means there would be 5 years of costs that are in our rates, or 20%, and 80% of those costs would be prorated and be beyond our 25-year review period. Likewise, example 2, if the project's being built in year 8, that means that there is about 17 years, or about 66%, that would be included in rates, and the balance would be beyond. And then back to example 1 on the far left-hand side, if there is a historical project that's already been completed in the past sometime, then 100% of those costs are in our rates today. So now that we know what percentage of cost gets allocated to the developers in rates today, we simply multiply that by the net cost. And as you can see, for transportation infrastructure, that totals just over $29 million. However, we also have to give the developers credit for what we have collected from them already up to this point in time for that infrastructure. And as you can see, the city has already collected about 17 odd million dollars for this. And that means that the net cost for transportation infrastructure in the city of Medicine Hat is just slightly shy of $12 million. So even though the total costs are 185, the portion that forms the rate for developers is about $12 million. And this particular slide sort of summarizes all of that in a single picture. We start with the total costs on the left, 185, less any grants or contributions, of which there are none. That leaves us a balance of 185, and then we allocate that to the parties that benefit. The city share for existing citizens is 79%, or about 146 million. Zero is allocated to other municipalities. There's about just shy of $10 million for developers, but that sits beyond our review period. And then in the top gray box is just over $29 million is the developer share that is within our rates today. Less the 17 million we've already collected leaves a balance of $11.9 million. And that forms the numerator for the transportation rate in the city of Medicine Hat. Now that we know what the costs are we're allocating to developers, the next thing we have to do is we have to allocate those costs to the lands that benefit. And you recall from the map that I showed you earlier that there are 12 offsite levy areas in the city of Medicine Hat. These are the 12 columns that you see listed across the top of this particular table. And the offsite levy model, the way we tell it to allocate costs to a particular piece of land is by turning it on by putting a little number 1 in the cell. If there's a little number 1 in the cell, the model knows it allocates a portion of the cost to the lands. And if there isn't, it does not allocate a portion of cost to the lands. For transportation infrastructure, you can see, with the exception of Area 8, which is all the developed land already, with the exception of that area, arterial roads benefit all lands. It doesn't really matter where I live, whether it's I live in the Northeast, I still benefit from the arterial road network in the Southwest and vice versa. If we were to look at the table associated with sewer infrastructure or stormwater infrastructure, it would not look like this at all. It would be very sporadic in terms of what lands benefited from what infrastructure. The last thing that we have to ensure that we're managing appropriately and that has an impact on rates is the levy account. You remember earlier that I mentioned that the MGA requires you to separate funds into an individual account for each infrastructure type. And so this particular table shows a forecast of the transportation account in your community for the next 25 years. And you can see that at some years it's in a positive balance, and in some years it's in a deficit balance. But the key thing is that no matter what the account balance is over the first 24 years, by the end of the review period, we know that the account has to get exactly back to balance. It has to be at zero at the end. You as a municipality are not allowed to make money off of the developers through this exercise. Likewise, we have to ensure we collect exactly the right amount for developers so that there is no additional burden placed on taxpayers. The account needs to get to balance, and the model adjusts the rates as need be to ensure that they get to balance, even when we factor in interest impacts, either positive or negative, throughout those 25 years. Oh, last few slides here, and then we'll open it up to questions. Just a quick summary. I've given you an overview of how levies work, the legislation, what's included in the like. But here's a high-level picture that more specifically as it relates to your community in all 4 infrastructure types: transportation, water, sanitary, stormwater. You can see them listed down the left-hand side of the table. And you can see that there is nearly over $400 million of infrastructure offsite levy related infrastructure in these 4 types alone. However, the portion that we allocate to developers and the developers will be paying for and financing over the next 25 years that's in our rates today is just over 121, almost $122 million. But you remember at the outset, I said that this conversation that we were having today was a $150 million conversation, and that's because the developers will be financing not only the portion of the infrastructure that is within our 25 years, but at some point also this portion of cost that is beyond the 25 years. These two combine roughly $150 million. By the way, this total of 122 million, that's about a 23% decrease from the costs that were included in your last bylaw a number of years ago. So all other things being equal, obviously, if costs are going down, we would expect rates to go down as well. There's another topic that I'm going to touch on briefly this evening. That's a very important topic that council should be mindful of. Not only do our rates factor in costs going forward and the like, but they also factor in something called front-ending. Front-ending is a term that is used when the municipality constructs and pays for infrastructure, including that portion of cost that is supposed to be paid for by developers. Often, there won't be enough money in the offsite levy account to pay for developers' share of the infrastructure. And so the municipality pays for it up front for them and then collects that money back as developers pay the levies over time. We refer to that as front-ending. So as you can see here, there is nearly $38 million of infrastructure that the city has constructed and paid for up to this point in time for which developers owe you. And you will be collecting, as these levies are collected from developers over time, that $38 million will be paid or repaid by developers. And that's a very common thing because as you think about it, the infrastructure almost always is built and paid for prior to development of the land happening. So the costs occur upfront, the revenues that you get from the levies occur down the road. And so front-ending is a sort of very common phenomena, but it's important that we manage what that number is. And that number today is around $38 million. So with that, I'm going to pause. That's a brief overview of offsite levies and how they work. And I would be happy to take any questions that that council has.
Thank you, Councillor Hirsch.
Councillor Hirsch.
Greg, at the start, I've got reverberation here. At the start of your presentation, you had indicated that we will
Can I
probably
just take a second and we'll see who has their speakers on. Hopefully we can get them turned off. All right. Sounds good. Councillor Hirsch.
As I was saying, Greg, thanks for the presentation, and you had indicated that we might not have any questions for you, and actually this question might be directed to staff because it actually predates you, because you get numbers from staff in terms of project costs, and that's kind of where my question starts. So when you get them on an annual basis, does that, and I guess this is the question to staff, does staff constantly redraft the costs for every project? And why I'm thinking construction inflation, I'm thinking supply chain, I'm thinking all that kind of stuff that absolutely probably throws a lot of wrench in numbers, which eventually when it goes to people like Greg, that forms the numerator. And I'm a bit need to understand that even though we're doing our fair share, we just need to make sure we're allocating dollars to projects that in terms of the budget. So maybe you can help me understand that piece.
Absolutely. Through your worship to Councillor Hirsch, to answer that question, we should be on an annual basis updating all of the inputs that go into the offsite levy model. That is a best practice. The current rates that we have in place are from 2017. So that is a gap that we've identified as part of this review that does need to get updated moving forward, is to ensure that we are updating those costs and ensuring too that our rates reflect what is required for development as well as the cost of today.
So then follow up. So, you know, it's funny, things go round and round. And so back in the day when I was on the whatever committee, we talked about off-site levies, and I was surprised that we didn't have, it wasn't reviewed near enough back in the day, and it sounds like we need to look at it again. But I had asked, and maybe I think we received it, where we did a bit of a construction inflation rider that made sure that every year we would adjust as we go, because back, it was, I think 2013 or 2012 and around that area where construction inflation was really, really rampant. And I just need to understand, like, is that something that we are considering again? Are we doing a rider that increases it on an annual basis? And what number is that, and how are we deriving that?
I can answer the
Did
first
you
part
want
of
me
that
to answer
question, and then I might defer to Greg. But to Councillor Hirsch, on an annual basis moving forward, we will be taking a closer look to ensure that costs actually reflect what they should as of today. And Greg can also speak to the model and how it also accounts for inflation itself, and it's built into part of the model, and that is also why we utilize it, as there's a lot of complexities that go into estimating what those costs are and ensuring that they reflect what the costs actually should be. Greg?
Yeah, it's a great question, Councillor, and obviously it's important. No project is built based on the estimate. Today, costs are almost always increasing. And so in the model, we include the actuals for historical projects. They are what they are. But for projects that are going to be built in the future, they also include inflated costs. So rates are not based on the costs that they see today. In fact, the slide that I showed you of $122 million of infrastructure cost, those reflect cost estimates in $22. But the rates themselves are actually based on the inflated cost to the year of construction. So inflation is built into the rates.
Thank you for that.
Councillor Knodel?
Thanks, Mayor Clark. So I have a couple different ones. I'll just start with one, and then if you're okay with it, I'll just go in order. So this is probably a little too simple, but I'll ask it anyway. So on the map on page, I think there's only one map, but page 30, when I first read this, I noticed that both section 8 and section 1 were significantly large. And I also observed that section 8 takes, older neighborhoods into consideration with that outline. Is the reason for such a large area because that particular section won't go through any significant new development or I'll just leave it at that. Any new expansion or development at any time soon?
Did you want me to answer, Randy, or have you got it?
Greg, if you'd like to take a stab at this one, that'd be good.
Sure. Area 8, Councillor. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, all of the lands in the areas, for the most part, are aligned with the infrastructure basins. That includes Area 1, the large area at the top. However, Area 8 is a unique area. Area 8 is an area that is effectively developed out in time. So there is no future development to occur other than redevelopment of property. So that's the uniqueness of area. And you'll notice that for most infrastructure types, there haven't been infrastructure that's been allocated to Area 8 for that reason.
Okay, thank you. That confirms my suspicions. What kind of stakeholders will you consult for thoughts and ideas about offsite levies as you move forward into the fall?
Through your worship, to Councillor Knodel, we currently are engaging with our different kind of community groups for developers. So the Chamber of Commerce is a stakeholder, the Urban Development Institute, the Build Group locally. We also have been in touch with direct large land developers directly, and they were all invited to our first stakeholder engagement session. That being said, as more find out about it, we will be inviting them as well to partake in a kind of a series of engagement sessions. but the main focus of our engagement is through kind of the community groups.
Thank you. So when a municipality hires someone like Greg, what exactly in our review are we looking to do? And then I actually had the same question as Councillor Hirsch. It appeared that our rates had decreased over time, and you answered that question. So I think I'll focus more on what exactly we hope to accomplish when we have a consultant like Greg work with us.
Through your worship to Councillor Knodel, so as part of this entire project, there has been different phases that we've gone through. The very first phase of this project was doing a third-party legal review to kind of identify internally what does the focus of our offsite levy framework need to look like moving forward, but also to identify gaps. And so there has been a lot of heavy lifting done by city staff in order to kind of get a better understanding of where the gaps are with our framework, what are things that we can better align. One of the main focuses of this update was to try to simplify where we could and try to make a really complicated topic simple, both for development community to better understand what offsite levies are and why we charge them, but also for administration of staff time and ensuring that it's a process that works for us as well. The next part of this project has been working more closely with Greg through Corvus, and they have been our model provider since the time that we've had an offsite levy model that has been this robust. So continuing on with them was a really good way of kind of ensuring continuity of business and also ensuring that our model reflects kind of all the inputs that we have today.
Last question. So how, and this is likely for staff, so how do developers respond to offsite levies? This is multi-step and maybe a little bit too big for this conversation, but you can tell me that. How many developers are in Medicine Hat, and what sort of innovation have we observed among the developers in the community? Would increasing offsite levies, would you say it would increase innovation if we were to have more, is there a relationship, I guess I'm looking to make, between the developers we currently have in the city and if we were to get more specific with different categories of services? So if we were to add more to our offsite levies, what kind of response will we get from the developers, and would we see more innovation if there was more categories added?
Sure. Through your worship to Councillor Knodel, within the city of Medicine Hat, I don't know the exact number of individual developers we have, but we do have a really large and robust development community. One of the main drivers behind offsite levies is to ensure that they're fair and equitable. When it comes to kind of innovation, a lot of the infrastructure that's identified is done so through servicing reports, and it ensures that we're really putting in the ground the infrastructure that's needed to support growth. The development community as a whole, we are trying to work very closely with them and be really transparent in the changes that we're making. However, any time that we are collecting money from the development community, there is always lots of questions and things that may come forward out of that. So we really want to ensure that we're building that relationship on the front side of this to ensure that they're on board when we do bring forward the bylaw amendment itself.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Dumanowski.
I was showing number 2, but I'll take the lead. Oh, okay. Through your worship, thank you. I was absolutely surprised at how much I was gleaning and learning from this presentation, not because I didn't expect it would be a full punch of good information, but having been here a while and having sat through many offsite conversation over that time, I thought I had heard it all. But there's a lot that came, and I have many notes here, and kind of like Councillor Knoll, I'm not sure, she had a number of questions, and if your worship, if you'll bear with me. First of all, Greg, thank you for the presentation. I'm trying to understand, and just a quick preamble, I know as a council, we've had these regular reviews and presentations, and staff in the past under different names as our governance models developed or evolved have come forward and spoken to the offsites and the inputs and the shortfalls or the other variables that went into developing future expectations, et cetera, and how it drived ultimately down to the developer and the cost to them. I know we've done that in-house predominantly. I think most of the years that I can recall. I'm glad at this point. I know that it was planned that we were going to go and do a full review, and that's where you come into this for a number of reasons. Because it's good to test the outside inputs against your own inputs as time goes on, and sometimes there's best practices or changes that pivots that we need to make that we didn't know were there, or we weren't certain were being used by other municipalities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You spoke to some of the changes in legislation that now are expanded or new that give us provision. I'm going to be curious about those in the near future, but we'll hold that for another day. One of the concerns or questions that maybe bears into this conversation today is you named them regimes. I think you called them regimes at one point in your presentation. But do our regimes or our categories, as you see it, I know you're just getting your feet wet and getting into the process and engaging public stakeholders, et cetera. But from an outsider looking inside, do you see that our regimes or our benchmarks more or less align with what other municipalities are using or using, I guess, as part of their calculations for offsite? It's kind of a macro question, and I ask that only because, and I'll maybe bookend it right now and you can kind of reflect on that, but we do a municipal assist portion, which is always separate. And part of the conversation I know in the past has been, and there's been lots of good, healthy dialogue by the stakeholders to have our municipality do some heavy lifting when it comes to not only the front ending piece that you spoke to, but the total costs in and of themselves, because if we didn't do that, it would stifle development and interest in our community. And so what I've come to understand, and I'll say because if I got it wrong, I don't want to put anyone in that position, but is that we were unique as a municipality in doing these municipal assists to the extent that we were, that in most cases, I'm going to generalize, 100% of the offsites in the midst of the calculators that we spoke to that go into this would be captured at some point in a true form. But as a municipality, we were changing those numbers in the form of municipal assists. So I know you're speaking strictly to offsite and the inputs and the calculations and whatnot, but can you speak to some of that as far as what you have observed so far?
Sure, I'll answer the question from two perspectives. I guess first perspective would be from the what's included in the city's offsite levy bylaw. Council, you asked about, or you alluded to the 4 infrastructure types and how that compares to other municipalities. And for the most part, most municipalities in Alberta still are charging for water, sewer, and roads. A good number are also charging for stormwater drainage related infrastructure like the City of Medicine Hat. And only a handful have begun charging for some of the soft infrastructure types. So as I said during my presentation, while I anticipate there will be many more, and maybe the City of Medicine Hat one day will also examine the inclusion of some of those others, the city is not offside as it relates to sort of the 4 infrastructure types versus the 4 that are excluded. There are a handful that are including recreation facilities. I know of 2 off the top of my head that are including fire halls. I know of no municipality, well, that's not true, potentially Calgary or Edmonton, that have included some form of cost as it relates to police facilities and or libraries. So the numbers are very small as it relates to the soft infrastructure type. So the City of Medicine Hat is very much aligned that way. The second part of my answer, and you touched on one aspect, municipal assist, I'll get to that in a second. There are 2 things that I felt that the City of Medicine Hat needed to update this time around, where it was quite different from sort of the common leading practices across most municipalities. And first was how it considered offsite levy areas. in your current bylaw, the city only included a handful of what it felt were development areas across the city. But those kinds of guesses can change rapidly. Where land is developing, what becomes popular and what isn't, often changes. And so it was very difficult for the city to ensure that it was catching all of the development that it needed to catch, or that infrastructure was allocated appropriately. And so this time around, your staff have done an excellent job of looking at the city in its entirety, defining those offsite levy areas. They may be adjusted down the road in a more granular nature, but they've set up the entire city from the get-go, which is the way it should be done. So that's number one. And the second one, Councillor, you already mentioned, and I was going to touch on it as well, and that's the municipal assist. City of Medicine Hat, back in, I guess it was the 2012, I think, when I was originally started assisting the City of Medicine Hat with offsite levies. And the city came up with a capital plan that resulted in very expensive offsite levy rates. The city was really unsure about the accuracy of those cost forecasts for future infrastructure, and so to make those rates more reasonable, it adopted, as you know, this municipal assist concept. The city is the only municipality in the province that I was aware of, and I continue to be aware of to this day, that adopted such a scheme. I have seen them elsewhere in other provinces, but the Medicine was the only one in Alberta. But the mechanism was put in place to offset what was thought to be a very wide variance in the cost estimates. And the intent at that time was, my understanding, that municipal assist would be phased out over time as those cost estimates got tighter and tighter. So now during this review, one of the things that the city staff, again, have done a great job on, and that is narrowing those costs down. I anticipate that the levy rates, although they haven't been finalized, they're still in draft format, and there's still many discussions to be had with developers and other local landowners. I anticipate that the rates ultimately are going to land on an average basis to very similar, and a number that is very similar to what developers were paying previously after the municipal assist was included. So I'm hopeful that through the discussions between staff and council and others, that you're able to ultimately remove that municipal assist, which serves to sort of make less transparent and hide really the what the costs are, what they need to be, and the management of rates in general. So those are the two things, Councillor, that I was hoping to see amended during this particular project. And so far, it appears that's the path that we're going down. So that's good.
May I continue, Your Worship? So I appreciate that response, and I'm not trying to, and nor are you, I'm certain, trying to prejudice the outcome. There's lots to be had yet, but you did identify the fact that we were and are the only municipality with a municipal assist. You kind of gave the background, which is a little bit lost on me, even though I was here at the time. I am curious how our, as you called them, narrowing or cost estimates are getting tighter and tighter and more accurate will now be enable us to move away from, I'll call it a skewed model, where our calculations are based on what we believe are the best factors at the time, but we change them in the form of municipal assist. So I want to say all this, none of this, my comments certainly, are not meant to suggest that we're not pro-development. We need development in our community, but we also need our numbers to accurately reflect that development and those true costs, so that development and future prospects can have confidence in the process and know what's coming forward. If I could, you did allude to the additional expanded pieces, and I'm not necessarily going to go to that now, but part of my thought, and you partially answered it, was if a municipality or if Medicine Hat were to add those, for example, and you're trying to extrapolate a 25-year timeline, and you got a municipal development plan and growth nodes that are evolving because they have changed and shifted through my time here, And I'm certain that causes chaos behind the scenes for staff and things like calculating offsites, because you anticipated steady, continuous growth, only to see there be a pause and a shift to another area, which obviously would change the landscape as far as that 25-year horizon. But how does a city, stay on side when it comes to that? Because the fact of the matter is, you will eventually need another fire department. You will eventually need new recreational centers. You will need to change your arterial roads collector roads maybe into an arterial system, and on and on. And I'm not trying to move 100 years into the future from SNF, but certainly anyone that's grown up here will have seen some significant shifts as our population growth has changed. And I'm just trying to understand how a city can accurately capture those without just, maybe I'm going to use the word prematurely, just planning for them right at the onset to say, you know what, we are in the next 25 years going to need another fire station in the north. So we're going to build that into our model without, being offside with the business community, the development community, to say we were starting to collect, but things have shifted, things changed, and we no longer need that. So I guess I'm asking a little bit of a rhetorical question, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, because my concern will be, and you partially answered, is that we seem to be on side where we should be calculating. We have front-loaded or front-ended 38 million, I think you said, that will be recovered. But there are a lot of those kinds of conversations that need to be had, and I'm glad that we're using the resources that you can bring, and our staff are extraordinarily capable. But and it's great to liaise with our development groups and get their input. But in the end, we have to try and get this right. So I don't know if you have a thought on that, but otherwise, I just want to thank you for your presentation. Very educational.
Thank you for that. Yes, two thoughts I can offer, Councillor. The first would be is ensuring that you have a land framework that is flexible and allows development to move on its own where need be, without sort of impacting that land framework. And that was one of the things, as I said, that staff took great pains during this project to do, and that was to look at the entire city and map that out. So it really doesn't matter where growth moves to. It we've sort of captured in that land staging forecast, no matter where it resides. The second point I was going to add was that the way to deal with that sort of long-term uncertainty is to not have a review period that is too long, that's too far out. And as I mentioned, the offsite levy model is underpinned by a 25-year review period. So while it could look out, and while there's probably lands in the city of Medicine Hat that are going to develop 75 or 100 years from now that are currently in boundary, we don't concern ourselves with that. We have a very reasonable review period that is very much aligned. 25 years aligns nicely with most municipal capital plans, including implementation time frame, and is a very reasonable repayment time period, 25 years. So that's, and then of course the last thing, and that is this: these models do not and cannot stay static for 25 years, for any period of time. They need to be continually amended and updated. So I mentioned previously that these should be amended annually, and that's so that the staging can be updated, capital plans can be adjusted on an ongoing basis, and rates continually reflect the most recent picture that you have as a municipality.
Councillor Van Dyke.
Thank you. And Councillor Dumanowski asked several of the questions that I had. So I only have one remaining, but first I want to thank you for a very comprehensive overview. My question is about front-ending, and I wondered if the amount that we have front-ended is typical for a community our size.
Great question, Councillor, and the answer to that would be yes. And how I sort of answer that question is because I look at ultimately the amount of infrastructure that you're looking to build and your rates. And again, like the previous councillor mentioned, I don't want to prejudge what those rates are going to be. The engagement with developers has not been completed yet. But if they are going to be similar to what I think they're going to be, the city is going to be at a level rate-wise that is at or lower than municipalities of similar size around the province. And so by extrapolation, the amount of front ending will typically be at or below what a municipality of similar size is going to look like. That graph that I showed you earlier, which was the transportation account, this sort of goes right to your question, Councillor. I showed you a graph. I don't know what page it is in your handouts. It's page 23 in my presentation. But anyways, if you look at that graph in your package, you will notice that the transportation account is forecast to be positive for about the first 10 years and then negative thereafter. That's actually abnormal. Normally what I see in most levy accounts is that it's negative for the entire time. So the fact is that the city has been able to build up a suitable reserve, if you will, a developer's account to build up a suitable reserve of developer funds to pay for some of the infrastructure that needs to get built in the first 10 years. But for the most part, in many municipalities, what the graph looks like is it's is in deficit significantly in the early part of the 25-year review period, and then gradually works its way back to balance at the end of the period. So I mentioned that just as an aside until you asked me about how front ending looks typically. And so from a transportation perspective, it's actually quite positive.
Councillor Sharps?
Hi, thank you. I just have two really quick questions. So on the levy, if it's on a development, so dumb question, so bear with me. So like, let's look at the old Safeway up at the mall. So if we would have done an off-site levy then, and now we're tearing it down, do they get charged again for the off-site levy? Can it be done twice on the same property, or is that a one-time thing?
So if the project was charged previously, you cannot go back and charge again. I'm not familiar with the Safeway lands, but if that Safeway lands were charged a levy previously, and when I say a levy, I'm not talking just about one levy. These actually, the way to think about them, you have four levies, four infrastructure levies: a water levy, a sewer, a stormwater, and a roads levy. So let's say that Safeway lands had previously paid water and sewer levies. I don't know if they have or they haven't, but let's assume that they have. Then you could not go back and charge water and sewer again. But if they had not paid a stormwater or road levy, when they put in for their new subdivision or development permit, then the city could charge those lands for those levies that have not been charged in the past.
Thank you, that clarifies, and I just one more follow-up question. So we talk about rate differences. So for example, we have a development occurring that's maybe outside of the safe zone of a fire department. Can you just bring in a certain zone so you can like do the fire levy so we can compensate for the extra fire department that needs to be built? Or if you do 5 of the levies, do you have to do all 5? Or is it, can you say if you're 10 kilometers out, you actually have to add this levy in, or you have to add a police levy in? Is it static?
No, a municipality can add any infrastructure type that it wishes. So if you wish at some point in the future to add a fire levy, you can do so without adding a recreation or a police levy. There's nothing that requires you to have them all at the same time. You can add them as you wish. And how you allocate the fire hall, let's look at fire if you were considering fire, how you would allocate that lands would be entirely dependent on how fire works. So for many communities, not many, for the few communities that are adding fire levies right now, they treat it very similar to roads infrastructure for the most part. And that is that the fire hall becomes part of a larger fire response network. And so it doesn't really matter where you live. They allocate those costs to all lands across the community, just like you do with arterial roads. That doesn't mean to say that Medicine Hat needs to do that, but that's just relaying to you what's being done typically by other municipalities that are implementing that levy. Although you should know, Councillor, and for all councillors, that if Medicine Hat is considering adding one of these soft infrastructure types in the future, recreation, fire, police, libraries, this is not an easy thing to simply turn on overnight. It would be if council would not be able to go to administration and simply say, we'd like to put in place a fire levy next month. Those 4 infrastructure types require significant background work and almost the development, maybe the best word to describe it is the development of a business case that outlines why the infrastructure is needed, what the costs are, who's going to benefit, how those costs are allocated to future development. So there's a significant amount of work that would need to be done before you could implement one of those soft infrastructure types. I just wanted to make sure council was aware of that.
I'm next. So I wanted to ask you about slide 7, which is financing offsite infrastructure costs. Is that rectangle image that you have? Is that intended to be accurate proportions as an image or not really?
No, Mayor Clark, that was just an example, a hypothetical example to say that if a portion is benefits, the municipality at large, then, it will not be allocated to development. Likewise, if a portion benefits a neighboring municipality, it would not be allocated to future development. So no, that was purely a hypothetical example, that picture.
Okay, so on your slide summary of cost allocations, it's near the end. It looks to me, I'm just confirming that for the infrastructure that's included in this model, 62% would be municipal share of the costs and 30% would be developer costs. Is that right?
Yeah, about $249 million would be municipal share of the costs, and about $150 million roughly would be the share of allocated to future development.
Okay. So this is also just a point in time, right? So if you wanted to do a pie chart of everybody's contributions, what we have here, this distribution would be only for the payment of offsite infrastructure that is for which offsite levies are paid. And then all future maintenance, replacement, all of that and operation of the infrastructure, that will be paid by the municipality and taxpayers. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. What you're seeing there for costs are only the capital costs, upfront capital costs of new infrastructure, because that's the infrastructure for which we're allowed to levy under the MGA. That does not reflect any operating costs of this infrastructure down the road in the future for the next 50 years or however long the infrastructure lasts, or the replacement of it at the end.
Thank you. And I have 2 questions for staff. On slide 14, which is basically outlining all the different development, like where we hope to go, or what, maybe it's the wrong slide, sorry. Oh yeah, you just have to zoom in real close. So it looks at where we expect development to go in the next 25 years. And I noticed that Northwest Industrial Park doesn't have any development allocated to it. But I think that, like, we've done an ASP and I think development is contemplated in the very near future there. So I'm just wondering if you could give me a little bit of an explanation on why no development was allocated to Northwest Industrial Park.
Mayor Clark, that is an excellent question. This is in its draft form, and in finalizing some of those numbers, that is something that we would be looking at. Given the fact that the ASP and outline plan are still in the works, those are numbers that will be added in as we kind of finalize some of the items moving forward, but very much so with the known ASPs that we have in place or that we are working on, those will be added in, and likely the number being 0 in that area is likely an error.
Thank you. And my last question is, Greg mentioned that 25 years aligns with the typical municipal capital plan. Is part of this process ensuring that our capital plan is up to date and as accurate as possible for a 25-year period?
Mayor Clark, to answer that question, we work very closely with mostly the City Assets Department, who has a multi of different servicing reports and capital plans that they put together in order to support this. A lot of it is pulling together different pieces from different reports in order to understand what is needed to support growth. One of the gaps that has been identified as well is pulling together certain pieces in different areas of the city. So one of the big items, Northwest Industrial Park, as an example, will pull the pieces together within that area and give us a better idea of what infrastructure is actually needed within that land in order to support growth. And similarly, as areas grow out and we receive those servicing reports, or potentially they're completed in-house, that will give us a better idea of what is required. And to a point that Greg made, it is very much a moving target. We put in all the information to our best of our knowledge today, but on an annual basis, as we are updating this, as we confirm items and have better understanding of what's required, that would be updated and reflected in the model itself.
Thank you. And seeing no further questions, I would like to thank Greg, Randy, and Conrad for your presentation today. Thank you. Can I get a motion to receive the presentation for information?
I'll give you that motion.
Second.
All right, we will vote. And that's unanimous. All right, moving on to presentation 7.3, Direct Control Development Permit, PLD P20220342, Robert Sissons, Manager Planning, and Randy Buckner, Superintendent Engineering, will be giving us a presentation, and this is in relation to item 8.1, which is the non-statutory public hearing in relation to this direct control development permit application. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor Clark, and members of council. So as mentioned, my name is Robert Sissons. I'm Manager of Planning, and I'm here to present on the Direct Control Development Permit application, PLDP 2022-0342. So just here's a brief overview of the presentation. First, I'll review the application details and site context. Then I will review some of the constraints of the property, such as servicing and geotechnical. And then I will finish up with some discussion about the restrictive covenant and provide administration's recommendation. So the development proposal is for the redevelopment of an existing single detached house. A house currently exists and would be replaced by a new two-story building with a rear walkout and attached garage. The site is designated as direct control in the land use bylaw, and this is pretty common for properties that may have geophysical risks. So whether that it's flooding or slope issues. Council is the approving authority for any DC applications, and on DC development permits, there is no appeal to the Subdivision and Development Appeal Board. So this is the proposed site development plan. This obviously doesn't come across very well on the presentation screen, but there is a copy in your council package. So in this particular case, north is facing left. And then the following 4 slides provide some perspective on the appearance of the development through elevation drawings. So this first one is from the north, so 11th Street. Here's a view of the development from the south, so generally from the Kipling area. This is the view from the west, where there are generally other development along 11th Street. And then finally, a view from the east, or what could be referred to as the Kingsway Corridor, Kingsway Avenue Corridor. So just to provide some context of the area, the subject property is on an extension of the coulee that projects from the southeast portion of the neighborhood. The site is somewhat isolated in that there is a coulee valley that separates it from other nearby development to the west, and it is set back a ways from the end of 11th Street. This type of lot is sometimes described as a panhandle lot, so it has a small portion of land for access that opens up into a larger area for development. This map shows the subject site, which is highlighted in yellow in relation to the other properties that are shown in red. So the property has access from the end of 11th Street turnaround, and the surrounding land has all been consolidated into a single environmental reserve lot in 2012. So this is the same map, but with half-meter elevation contours added. Those are shown in brown, and the citywide slope setback line from the 2014 EBA report, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
EVA is?
EBA is just the consultant that prepared the report, yeah. It was a city-commissioned report that was prepared in 2014. So I'll just note that the geotechnical report that was provided does have LiDAR information that was gathered for the site by Benchmark Geomatics Land Surveying Company, which would be much more precise and current than what we have in our GIS system for elevation contours. So this is a oblique aerial view of the site from the southwest. This is taken in the spring of 2022. And this is another oblique aerial image from the north. This is a photo of the existing house and vegetation from the northwest. And then another photo of the existing house from the east. So as part of the development permit application, upgrades to servicing will be required. And that is standard with all development applications, that upgrades are at the cost of the developer. So the site is located on geophysical risk lands as identified within the land use bylaw. Based on the development proposal, a site-specific slope stability assessment was requested. A finalized version was provided to administration around the middle of July. And this report used as a base the broader geotechnical study the city conducted in 2014, which established a lot of the geotechnical risks and slope setbacks throughout the community. So the site-specific slope stability assessment was completed by Gem Testing Limited, who undertake many of these types of reviews throughout our community on an annual basis. The report was prepared to meet the requirements of both the land use bylaw, so specifically section 5922, and the existing EBA report. The report provides design and construction requirements for the development, and these must be adhered to, and this is listed as condition number 5 on the development permit. So based upon the report, the developer has adjusted the design of the development, and the geotechnical engineer has reviewed and stamped those final drawings. So this is just a plan that shows the updated slope development setback line, and that's highlighted in blue there, the blue dashed line, and then the crest of the slope, which is shown in red. I'll note that a small portion of the sun deck and supporting pile encroach into the setback. However, the geotechnical report does specifically address this issue and mentions it on pages 5 and so on in the report. Setbacks of the development from the property line and setbacks of the slope setback line from the crest of slope are identified within this site plan, and the black arrows provide a general surface drainage pattern. So in the late 1980s, as part of a land transfer, a restrictive covenant which restricts future development was registered against a portion of the site. However, it does not cover the entire portion of the parcel upon which the proposed development is to be constructed. And should be also noted that no other parcels in the immediate area have the same restrictive covenant on them. So subsequent to the Municipal Planning Commission, PDS, so Planning and Development Services, has determined based on a further review of best practices established in other communities in Alberta that additional legal agreements may be appropriate to assist in managing risks associated with this top-of-slope development. So PDS will now further evaluate such best practices to determine which legal agreements and terms and conditions would be appropriate under the circumstances for this development, and will thereafter contact the city solicitor's department to request their assistance in drafting the same. So administration therefore recommends that development permit condition number 6 should be amended to read as follows. The applicant shall enter into such additional legal agreements with the city as the city solicitor and the city planner may, at their sole discretion, deem necessary or appropriate for the purpose of addressing certain risks risks associated with the top of slope developments. And the applicant shall at all times thereafter comply with the terms and conditions of such legal agreements. So administration's recommendation is it is recommended through the Municipal Planning Commission that City Council approve development permit PLDP 2022-0342, subject to the listed conditions, but as amended or suggested amended by the change to condition number 6 as noted on the previous slide. That concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you. On account of us having a public hearing scheduled, and that's the next item up, I would, council will hold their questions and comments until the public hearing has been opened. Thank you very much. Stay close, though. I anticipate there will be questions and comments. Can I get a motion to receive the presentation?
I'll motion.
Second.
And that's unanimous. Moving on to non-statutory public hearings. 8.1, proposed direct control development permit application, PLDP 2022-0342, single detached house, 1123 6th Avenue Southeast. Acting City Clerk Robinson, were there any submissions received?
Mayor Clark and Council, there was one submission received that has been included in the agenda packet from Daryl Lynn Haney.
Thank you. I call the public hearing for proposed direct control development permit application PLD P20022, 0220342 to order. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak for or against this development permit? If so, please come down to the podium and state your name. Hello. Can you please say and spell your first and last name for the record and identify whether you're speaking in favor or against the proposed development permit?
Good evening. My name is Ray Hoger, R-A-Y-H-O-G-E-R, and I am speaking opposed to the permit number. My house is across the street, approximately 100 meters from the proposed development. I have 3 points, 3 questions perhaps. The first one being, why are we even considering building in an area that we know has the potential, the unstable and unsafe area? We've seen many areas in that, or parts of that trail down there where it used to be all shale, now it's all paved because the shale is all washing away whenever we get any heavy rains. I noticed in the development permit, there are 8 conditions attached to it, including concerns of surface water drainage, utility service questions, liability of future slope instability, and roadway drainage issues. And all of these potential issues come with the proviso that the city has no liability, and any costs to address these issues will be borne by the developer. The slope stability agreement, or report that was mentioned from GEM, it suggests that they will have to probably drive piles or place piles and compact density to 98% to address and hopefully remedy some of those potential issues. My second question, however, since my property and several others within this 100-meter zone, what guarantees are the city seeking for the possible damage to our property, our foundations, our walls, other property elements that we have, if in 1 month or 6 months, 6 months or 6 years, as a result of those compacting machines, the heavy construction, et cetera, we're on a sandhill. And those vibrations can possibly, I'm not saying they will, but can possibly roll right through to our area, to our homes, and there's no provision in any of this for the people in that area. My third question, I hope it's rhetorical. I hope you don't ask yourselves this question in 5 months, 5 years, maybe 10 years. What were we thinking? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hoger. I would like to give Robert and or Randy an opportunity to add any additional information that they have in response to Mr. Hoger's concerns.
Your worship, just in response to that, as part of this application, one of the requirements was completing a slope stability assessment and ensuring that that is authenticated. And the recommendations from that come from a professional geotechnical engineer who has taken a look at both of the soils within that area and provided site-specific recommendations for development. As part of a condition to the development permit itself, those recommendations all do have to be met. As part of the report that was completed, risk to outside homes or homes within that general area was not identified as an issue. As well as one of the key items, I think, with any major construction project is understanding that the developer or other bodies also do carry appropriate insurance and whatnot to ensure that they are covered in the unfortunate circumstance when something like that does occur. However, in this circumstance, the geotechnical report provided by the professional engineer does indicate that there was no risks associated with that.
Can you restate the part, what happens if there is damage to other properties that occur despite the fact that the geotechnical study didn't suggest that there would be?
Your worship, to answer that question, and if legal is available to provide some guidance on that, that would be ideal. However, in the circumstances that does occur, typically there is assessments that are required by other geotechnical engineers, whether that's at the cost of the developer completing the project themselves, as well as potentially the parties themselves. The city would play a role in that, as we do own land that is environmental reserve around that area as well.
Councillor Van Dyke? Oh, sorry. Mr. Sissons?
I was just going to add, so in this particular property, they've obviously gone through and done additional work, but this is kind of a standard practice. So even if this wasn't near a slope and I'm doing, let's say, an infill development, I'm tearing a house down, and there's an issue and I impact a neighboring property, there is a certain amount of liability then that would be attributed to that developer, right? So this happens all the time. If this was to be a property several doors down from where this one is, and we're looking at an infill, there would be the same type of question that would be asked. So this happens on a day-to-day basis. And this one is just a little bit more heightened because of where the property is.
Councillor Van Dyke?
Yes, thank you. I have a few. Is that okay? Okay. So I had a question regarding demolition. So I noticed in the engineering report that it talks about the impact on the slopes in the building of the property, but it doesn't talk about potential impacts from the actual demolition. And I'm wondering if that has been taken into account, if that could destabilize the area in advance of the construction. And if, maybe I missed it. That's my first question, and then I'll get to the next one.
Through your worship to Councillor Van Dyke, as part of the recommendations within the GEO report, again, they were specific to issues that were raised as part of the assessment that they do. The demolition itself is of the home structure itself. I do believe there is a basement, but it is not deep removal of materials or deep kind of excavation that is taking place in order to demo the building that is there. Also, the footprint of the home is quite small in comparison to the development that is taking place. So demolition was not identified as kind of a high-risk construction activity taking place. Really, the reconstruction and some of the other recommendations were made is really the focus of what the geotechnical engineer believes are risks associated with the project itself.
Okay, my second question is around erosion. So a lot of the geotechnical report has to do with sloughing and slippage, but I didn't see any kind of a forecast on anticipated erosion of the site over time. And as a person, a long-time, lifetime resident of Medicine Hat, I have seen erosion around the coulees over my lifetime. And I'm just wondering about provisions for erosion on the site plan.
Through your worship to Councillor Van Dyke, again, the recommendations do speak to ways to eliminate some of the risks associated with erosion, so decreasing watering. There's certain requirements of things that cannot be built on the site. When it comes to environmental reserve land where we do see erosion taking place, it is something that we do monitor and do kind of look at ways that those kind of issues could be addressed. But in the report itself, it does speak to kind of mitigating recommendations to ensure that erosion doesn't continue to be an issue in that area. The other part of the condition is that erosion and anything at that is at the risk of the developer.
Okay, and one final question and or comment regarding potential swimming pool and swimming pool leakage. So I did notice that there is recommendations in there in the event of a pool being added to tie potential pool leakage, which is very common, into the weeping tile, and which will then go out into the storm system. And I'm just wondering how that meets environmental regulations, given the fact that we had to close Heights Pool due to the drainage of that pool into the stormwater system, which is not allowed.
Your worship, to Councillor Van Dyke, currently this proposal does not include a pool. It is kind of a general recommendation that we do see in a lot of our geotechnical engineering reports. The other item I will note is that it is likely that it is speaking to the weeping tile tying into the sanitary system, which I believe is a more common practice that we see with the pools. I will highlight though that this current proposal does not show a pool, and as part of future development, we would likely require further geotechnical assessment to ever permit a pool on that site.
Councillor Knodel.
Thanks, Mayor Clark. I promise I'll be faster than last time. So we'll start with this one. Thanks for answering all these questions, by the way. I appreciate it. Aside from property taxes, what benefits do you see to the adjacent and nearby community, and what social or environmental risks do you see that do exist?
So, through your worship to Councillor Knodel, in terms of the benefits of seeing our older housing stock redeveloped over time, I think has just a general effect on an area that you want to see that reinvestment put into a community so that the population remains stable in that area. And sorry, what was your second part to your question?
So we've kind of talked about environmental risks, so I'm going to scrap that. What social risks do you see exist from a unique build like this for redevelopment?
With social risks?
Yes.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if a single detached house does provide, so the rebuild, if that provides any increased social risk, if you will, over what exists there today, which is a single detached house. When we review these applications, we're reviewing them more on the land use bylaw and the impact. Does it meet the regulations? Does it meet technical specifications, for example, the geotechnical side of things? So we don't necessarily view it from that perspective at that micro level of a single detached house.
Okay, and then final question. Is this build connected to an individual who wants to build it and the developer's building it for that person? Or is it built with the hope that it'll be purchased post-build?
Through your worship to Councillor Knodel, my understanding is that it is the developer is building it for themselves, but I believe they are in attendance. So that's correct.
Councillor McGrogan?
Thank you. Just a quick one. I'm familiar with the report. There's been a lot of work put into this report. There's been a lot of due diligence. The one question that did come up was around the lift station. It's a minor thing, but is the lift station, if required, a separate structure, or is it part of the infrastructure of the home itself?
Through your worship to Councillor McGrogan, typically a lift station of this size is quite small and would be part of the actual development itself. I will note too that as part of the current design, one is not required. However, if once they start construction and it's identified that they can't meet certain grades in order for sanitary flows, then one could be considered.
Councillor Dumanowski?
Your worship, I didn't know if I would ask this question after the hearing is complete or not, but it seems to fit the theme, and we have our planning department speaking in favor of the applicant. So the amendment to condition 6 that was addressed in a separate slide, and it speaks to the applicant entering into additional legal agreements with the city and city solicitor, city planning at their discretion as deemed necessary or appropriate for a purpose of addressing certain risks associated with the top of slope developments, and the applicant shall at times thereafter comply with the terms and conditions of such legal agreements. So I would surmise that the addition of this amendment to condition 6 suggests that there are concerns legally on behalf of the city. Can you address very specifically and transparently what those concerns are, and thus why the need for this amendment?
So through your worship to Councillor Dumanowski, so the use of a restrictive covenant on the property allows the city to place additional guarantees, if you will, and provide further clarity. It allows us, one possibility could be to tie that specific geotechnical report to that property. We could look at exploring what that liability would be for the city as well. But that would be based on further discussion with our city solicitor's office as we progress, and just kind of generally as we learn more what other communities are doing to protect themselves from future issues such as this. This is one area that we've kind of been reaching out in the interim from when we had this item at Planning Commission to today, to just basically put in a system that protects the city and protects neighboring properties. And that this is, I will note that we do on other properties where we have new subdivision, we will put this restrictive covenant on those properties, but in this particular case, there is no subdivision, so we would be doing it. We have this opportunity through a development permit to put that as a condition.
Just supplementary, Your Worship. So this is coming as an amendment, so this is coming after it had already gone to MPC. So I don't know if yourself or the solicitor, I believe he's on Video World here, that we can hear his perspective as to why this amendment was added after the fact. What concerns he had from the legal side of things to include this amendment.
Thank you, Your Worship, and to the councillor. I note, looking at the discussion with planning occurred after the MPC legal was further engaged, and looking at the development conditions in the staff report, we can see in section 5 that it makes clear reference to the city not being liable for future instability. And in discussions, it was noted by planning, as just discussed, that there is potentially a desire to use other instruments, including a restrictive covenant, to ensure that the city's interests are protected in the event, albeit perhaps unlikely, of a slope stability issue in future.
I'll just end with how I understood what you said is that, albeit that these are often, these restricted covenants, pardon me, are added to these types of developments. I guess in a macro sense, there is a concern, and the ultimate liability concern on behalf of the city, whom you represent, and so does the solicitor, are going to exercise these additional amendments to ensure that if there are any unusual slope stability or erosion issues of any kind, the city would be off the hook, so to speak. Is that in plain language what I heard?
Certainly the city's objective to protect against any undue liability flowing to the city. But I think also an option for planning to explore is what if neighboring properties are affected, and what options based on best practices elsewhere might be able to address in the course of these additional legal agreements. So really it's planning is looking into that issue. I think that we heard from Mr. Sissons, and as it becomes clear as to the instruments that are best positioned to protect the city's interests and the neighboring properties, those will be brought forward as proposed legal agreements in light of the amended Clause 6.
Your Worship, I'll end there. I will have closing comments after the statutory public hearing is concluded.
Councillor Hyder.
Through the chair, I just would like to commend Robert and Randy for all their hard work and their team on this presentation. It's very interesting to see. I've grown up here my whole life, and I forgot there was a house over there. Obviously, the house is vacant, and it's very interesting to see a developer, a well-known developer in our community, want to take the opportunity to develop that piece of land. So I find this very interesting, and thank you for all your hard work.
Councillor Hirsch.
Thanks, Your Worship. Just through the chair, I just wanted to get some details just for my understanding. So in the report, it speaks to a stability line, and my understanding is the house is within the stability line as far as the recommendations go on the site plan. Is that correct?
Through your worship to Councillor Hirsch, the geotechnical report outlines a updated slope stability setback line. The current proposed footprint of the home is outside of that line. There is a portion of the sun deck that does encroach upon that. However, there are specific recommendations for design components that must be met in order for that to be built the way that it is proposed.
So it can be mitigated. I read the piece about the piles, et cetera, so I understand that. Thank you. It mentioned about downspouts not to be discharged onto the slope, and really in any development world, we talk about making sure that any rainwater, et cetera, stays within lots. Is that what this is relative to as well, that any type of rain that comes off the roof stays within the property, doesn't get discharged outside of any areas, only within the lot? Is that fair to say? Or I guess, and I do have a follow-up question on that, where I'm going.
Your worship, to Councillor Hirsch, this is a very common recommendation that we find within our geotechnical reports, and it is to ensure that we are controlling and also aware of where storm drainage is going. And so in this circumstance, the recommendation is to ensure that stormwater isn't going to the back of slope, that it is going in a direction that would not be impeding or causing further concerns or issues with erosion on the slopes themselves. So it really is a mitigation recommendation. And again, something very common that we see with development requiring geotechnical assessment.
Okay, thank you. And I guess the question, I've got a couple more. And this is more, and maybe you can answer it, maybe you can't, but I'm thinking, based on the geotechnical report, the result is that it's a safe lot, et cetera, within guideline. The question becomes, in my mind, can a homeowner, I'm not speaking of the applicant, but in this situation, could a homeowner do enough material events on his or her property to create a material slope problem, soil compaction problem, et cetera, both deliberate or otherwise? I'm just saying, is the homeowner, because we can't track, short of a swimming pool application, short of another development on the property, effectively that lot could go, just like any one of ours, I could overwater my lawn. If I overwater my lawn at that lot, is that going to create a problem?
Your worship, to Councillor Hirsch, that is, again, one of the recommendations coming from that. And many of the times when we do see recommendations like this, they are to ensure that there's not further concerns. When it comes to overwatering, it's not really a groundwater issue on this site, and that's typically one of the recommendations that's come from that, but it is to ensure that stormwater, again, is going in a specific direction. The other idea behind registering a restrictive covenant to the site is to ensure that these recommendations follow the parcel. So if the home is to change ownership, that those recommendations remain, and as well as to limit potential future development of the site and requiring that a development permit is required for certain things that are done on the site. And that also gives us the ability to ensure that we are still in alignment with that geotechnical report.
So thank you for that. And further to that, when that gets on the, when this recommendation gets registered, does it get registered on title as a caveat then? For a future person that buys this property, for example, are they aware via title that a lawyer could stumble upon and say, oh, by the way, it's registered on title, the following caveats? Are they going to be listed there?
Your worship, to Councillor Hirsch, that would be something that we'd be exploring, and is part of the potential recommendations that we found is by registering a restrictive covenant, it would very clearly then identify both the report, and we can also pull out specific recommendations that need to follow, and that does follow the title.
Okay, and then I just actually have a final question to both the person, Mr. Holger. Your address? 566. Okay, and then there was a submitted letter. Darylyn, your address, if you're willing to. Thank you. That's it for me. Thank you.
Councillor McGrogan.
Thank you. Through the chair, just to follow up to Councillor Dumanowski's question around the addition of condition 6. I just want to have it clear in my mind that when I guess it's vote time, is there a possibility with this condition, I guess there's always a possibility, is there a likelihood that this could stop the application if, because you said, I heard a couple times that we're going to continue to explore best practices, which is great. Is there a chance that the resulting from all those explorations with other municipalities around their best practices, that this thing could be halted? I guess that might be rhetorical, but I guess I'm curious in an overall sense.
So through your worship, to Councillor McGrogan, that is a possibility that the proponent could decide to not continue with the project, but really what we would be looking for within the restrictive covenant would not be anything out of the ordinary and would be nothing contrary to what the recommendations of the geotechnical report are. And it would just be just spelling out a lot of the areas around liability and those types of things. I think that's where we kind of see this going further. So, and like we did mention earlier that these are in place in other areas of the city already. So it's not something totally new to the city. It's just generally you don't see this at a development permit stage. And based upon our more recent research, just looking at some other best leading practices from other communities, and specifically Calgary has some really good guidance on some of the activities that they've taken towards this.
Okay, so you mentioned that one possibility is to register a restrictive covenant, but that's not currently a condition.
So to your worship, currently staff's recommendation that was made at the Planning Commission did not include that. Since then, we've felt based on some of the feedback and some of the research into best practices that we are amending our recommendation to include that condition 6 be amended from removing the existing restrictive covenant to amending it as was discussed on the slide.
Right, but if I'm understanding that properly, that's just any legal agreements. We don't know that it's going to be a restrictive covenant. We don't know that it's going to be registered on title. We don't know that it's going to protect adjacent homeowners. I guess one of my concerns, and this is maybe a follow-up to Councillor Hirsch, is if I'm an adjacent homeowner, the fact that I could sue someone if there was damage to my home wouldn't necessarily be that comforting. What I would want to know is, have the risks been mitigated close to zero? And so I know that Councillor Hirsch talked about overwatering the lawn, but I think the broader question was, in 50 years or 75 years, this house is still there, maybe there's a new owner. How do we police all of the geotechnical recommendations? Like the risk is pretty great, like slumping, that's a pretty big issue. Could in fact have, life-threatening implications. So I'm just wondering, given that the risk is so high, is it the case that in the future, if we're not policing the recommendations, that something really bad could happen?
So through your worship, I'll take a first crack at this, and maybe Rani can jump in if she has anything further to add. So just going back to one of the comments earlier about if this was just an existing homeowner, they can water their lawn. When the city did the 2014 study, one of the recommendations, and we do have a pamphlet and promotional material for the public about best practices around living in and around slopes. In terms of what happens in 50 years, so we would hope that any property owner would maintain their property so as not to cause any issues. And that's whether it's just maintaining a structure to make sure it's not getting into a state where there's risk of it falling over. But in this particular case, all of the reports and recommendation, everything would be registered on title. So it would be just one other measure that would allow it to kind of follow that property going into the future. We would have ability to then go in and enforce it as required. And it would just spell out things in a little bit more detail. There's always risk though. You can never eliminate risk 100% in any property development.
Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm kind of wondering is, in addition to the amendment that you've put forward, is there intended to be another condition that we file a restrictive covenant or register a restrictive covenant on the property outlining the recommendations in the geotechnical report?
So, to your worship, so staff's additional recommendation was to amend that condition that says discharge the existing restrictive covenant, because that one, as it stands right now, does not, it's not doing much. It's just basically addressing a very small portion of the property that was consolidated into the larger parcel. So our recommendation would be that we look to amend that existing restrictive covenant to update it to the entire parcel probably, and to include various different aspects that would do things such as tie the specific report to that RC, to look at liability, to look at those various different things. The existing restrictive covenant has almost no information. It just says no future development should be allowed. So it doesn't have a lot of context or anything like that associated with it. So that would be our recommendation, or our amended recommendation.
Who registered that restrictive covenant?
So through your worship, it was registered in, I want to see, I think it was prepared in 87, but registered in 91, so over 30 years ago. So I believe the solicitor at the time registered it.
So the city of Medicine
Yeah,
Hat?
it's between the city
Okay.
and the legal firm that was on represented at the time.
Okay, Councillor Hirsch?
Just one question I forgot. So based on the plans, it looks like it's going to be assembled on grade. The house is going to be on grade, not in a foundation, like no basement or anything? There's going to be a basement? Sorry, no, I get a walkout, but that doesn't necessarily mean. So how, as far as excavation go, as far as foundation, what's the depth going into the ground?
Through your worship to Councillor Hirsch, I don't know the exact depth into the ground, but it is at a depth that does not require like a deep fill or a further report. That would have been, again, a recommendation out of the geotechnical report. So there is excavation on site, but it is quite minimal. And again, will be mitigated through the recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, for a second time, if there is any member of the public who wishes to speak for or against this development permit, please come down to the podium and state your name. You are Darylyn Hanley, correct?
I'm
Haney?
Haney.
Haney.
H-A-N-E-Y. Last name Haney, H-A-N-E-Y.
Thank you.
And I did put in a written submission, and so I apologize for coming forward to speak as well, but I find that many of the questions in my written submission were not addressed, and so I feel I need to bring them forward. Specifically, a lot of the geotech report that was done was based on the slope stability of where the home will be built and where the development is to occur, but none of it addressed the slope stability or the stability of the surrounding area and the surrounding homes. So it was only specific to whether or not that home would be stable, but not what would they, what could happen to the homes in the surrounding area. And specifically, I know that there will be heavy equipment operating in the area in order to build the foundation and in order to build that home. And I believe that the slope stability of the area would be affected by that, just because it is, we live, as Mr. Hoger said, on a sand lot. And that kind of instability could seriously impact our homes. And so the questions that I feel didn't get answered is what liability would the city have if they approve the development without looking into first what the impact would be on the surrounding homes? All right, I'd like to know that. I'd also like to know if the city would be willing to pay for an engineering report on my home, or whether the developer would, on my home prior to any development, so that if there is a problem, that it won't be disputed because there would have been a preliminary engineering report completed prior to the development. And then as well, I'm also wondering if there is damage, and we notice damage during the building phase, would the city be willing to step forward and stop the development before it progresses to a point where the damage is irreparable in our homes? All right, I'm concerned about those things. And again, I also raised that I was worried about the caveat that was removed. It does state under subsection 5922 and clause 4, it says that only if the applicant has provided a geotechnical report prepared by an engineer licensed to practice in the province of Alberta, qualified by training experience to express a professional geotechnical opinion which states that the development itself, its potential occupants, and any existing or potential new developments in the vicinity will not be at risk. We are in the vicinity, we are close to this development, and I want to know before anything starts that we're not going to be at risk. All right, we have a 100-year-old home. My family has owned this home for the past 50 years. It is very stable, and I would like it to stay that way. And I think before you approve this, they had a lot of we're looking into and we're going to be doing and we're going to consider this and we're going to consider that. I think those considerations need to be made before you approve this development.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I would just like to clarify the 3 questions that you're, so it's paragraph 4 of your letter. Given that there's a risk of destabilization in the area, what liability would the city have if they approve the development and some damage does occur?
Right.
And then question 2, would the city or developer be willing to cover the cost of a geotechnical report on your property prior to the development?
And then does the city have any power to halt the development?
Once it started?
Once it starts.
Okay. I will, thank you. I will refer those questions to our Planning and Development Services representatives here.
Through your worship, to the residents, kind of 3 questions. The first one having to do with the responsibility, or I guess one of the questions was, is the city willing to cover the costs of assessing the current condition or foundation and structure? That is not typically a common practice to have the city kind of fund a geotechnical report assessing that. However, the city does have, and I think to the first question that was asked as well, a broader geotechnical report that identifies areas within the city where there are risks. So that's the EBA report. That outlines essentially if other properties are at risk or what the slope setback line is, and that kind of within itself has some broader items that would typically impact like adjacent properties or something. The specific slope stability assessment that was completed does identify, again, that it is in compliance with that EBA report, so it is meeting all of the requirements as per that broader City of Medicine Hat geotechnical report. To the second question of, I guess, would the city be willing to cover the costs? That is, again, not a typical practice that we see. There are ways of, again, clarifying liability and responsibility through agreements, and hence the recommendation to add in or amend condition number 6. And then the city does have power to halt development. That's typically through a stop work order if there are concerns with the development or if they are not complying with the conditions of the development permit, which further are the conditions and recommendations within that geotechnical report. So if the geotechnical report was not being followed and the recommendations and requirements within that report were not being followed, we do have the ability to issue the formal process would be through a stop work order.
Thank you. I'm still a little, I I believe what was said before about the liability of the city is that we would be trying to contract out of liability for any disruption to adjacent properties as a result of the development.
Your worship, I think what we would be looking to do through either, again, a restrictive covenant or other agreements, which the city has entered into before, is really determining where that responsibility of liability remains and seeking that to the developer who is the party wishing to develop this parcel takes on most of that liability. The other important thing to note too is the report was completed by a professional engineer. It's an authenticated report. They also have standards that they must uphold within authenticating that report itself. So that's the reason that we do ask for a report that is authenticated by a qualified professional engineer, as they are kind of the subject matter expert on the slope. And if they're deeming that it could be developed, there's kind of validity behind that.
And what about the comment that the geotechnical report deals with the site specific to the development only and not the surrounding area?
Your worship, again, kind of going back to there's two geotechnical reports, essentially the broader EBA, which looks at the entirety of the city, and further common practice, and again, is to look at the site-specific area, and that's typically what we require for a development permit, is to look at the development of the site itself. If there were off-site impacts, those are typically then also identified within the geotechnical report. That's the purpose of it, is to determine if that site can be developed or not.
Typically, but was it in this one?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess there's a lot of specific things that I would like to see as conditions rather than just like the broad, more agreements might be forthcoming. Would it be typical for if a caveat, or sorry, a restrictive covenant was to be registered, it would be specifically named in the conditions?
To your worship, if that's what council deems as advisable, they could require that as a condition. Otherwise, typically that's kind of our where we have that ability to enforce those conditions is through that development permit. So if council wants to enact certain things or request or require certain things, and council through a direct control permit can amend the conditions however they so choose. That's where we would recommend it, is that they that be amended to be placed on the development permit.
Thank you. For a third and final time, if there is any member of the public who wishes to speak for or against this development permit, please come down to the podium and state your name. Welcome, and can you please say and spell your first and last name for the record and identify if you're speaking for or against the proposed development permit?
My name is Jerry Lynn Hovey, H-O-V-E-Y, and I'm opposed to the development. I'm adjacent to that property where that little gray house is. Her name was Carol that owned that house. I live adjacent to that, and it's been a family home over 70 years. My home is over 100 years old. I remember that street that's no longer there, going down the hill. We used to play over the hill, see all these remnants of the houses that were once there. I used to slide down the hill next between Carol's house and my house to go down to the park in the coulee. Can't do that anymore. At that time, we used to toboggan there. The land's not there. It's eroded. The house that I own, my grandparents owned. Then my grandmother sold it to my uncle. My uncle decided to expand and put through the development of expanding that home through the engineer and whatever, like these people are doing for this property. and submitted it to the city. I don't have those papers. I didn't have time to get those papers. It was denied because of the slope. The land there is hardly there compared to what I remember as a child. It's going to erode, and it'll keep on doing that, and it's going to damage our houses with this type of development. And I do oppose to this, absolutely, for the history, the hill, the home surrounding. Not good. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you care to respond to that? Do you have any additional information you wanted to add? Okay. Any more questions or comments from council or staff before we close the hearing? Seeing none, I now declare the public hearing closed. And I really apologize. I would like to briefly adjourn for a bio break, 5 minutes, and we will come back. Thank you. All right, we will resume. So at this point, we can entertain a motion to approve, deny, or amend the development permit. I will caution that doing amendments on the fly with something that is outside of our area of expertise carries with it some risk. So, but I will entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to amend condition 6. You want me to read it out? The applicant shall enter into such additional legal agreements with the city as the city solicitor and the city planner may, at their sole discretion, deem necessary or appropriate for the purpose of addressing certain risks associated with top-of-slope developments, and the applicant shall at all times thereafter comply with the terms and conditions of such legal agreements.
I'll second.
Sorry, excuse me, if I could ask, are we voting on the amendment or voting on the motion?
Sorry, we're voting on the amendment.
Okay.
Just point of procedure, Your Worship. So we closed the hearing, and we haven't had our opportunity to have our conversation before any amendments. So I'm wondering if the amendment should wait because it may bear one consideration, no consideration, or otherwise to support or lack thereof. I'm wondering if the debate should occur and then an amendment should come forward.
Yes, I mean, typically we would have a motion to get the proposed development on the table for discussion and debate. You can respond to Councilor Dumanowski's question. So the question is, we need to now debate the development permit, and we need a motion to get it on the table, and then we can deal with any additional motions to amend.
That's correct, Mayor Clark. We would need a motion to put it on the table.
Just further point of procedure, we would put it on the table, but we wouldn't vote until the debate's been had.
Yeah, it's a motion to put it on the table for debate and discussion.
Okay, I just saw the voting button flashing, so I was worried we were jumping the gun.
A motion was made to amend the conditions in the development permit, and that's what we would be voting on at this point. But your point is taken that the debate may impact that. So would you be okay with deferring the motion until after we have put the application on the table?
Well, if that's the proper route, my thinking was we would amend as recommended and then vote on the whole thing, the development together with that amendment. And I would guess that, and I could be wrong, but the voting motion shouldn't happen until we discuss the merits first of this particular amendment and then vote on it. And then if it's voted yes, then I think we would have then the further debate about the actual development permit, no? Is that how it's going to be?
I've never done this, Your Worship, but third point of privilege or clarification. But if we vote on amendment, a motion with an amendment, we're voting for a motion with an amendment, whether it's one. We haven't done the debate. We haven't had the conversation. So I think it can be brought forward, but we should have our conversation first, and then the vote would occur as amended.
So it's not, I think we can do it either way. So what Councillor McGrogan is proposing is that we amend it so that it includes the recommended amendment, and then we put the development permit as amended on the table for debate and discussion. And then subsequent to that debate and discussion, if there are no further motions, we would vote on the development permit as amended. Jessica, or do you have any comments?
I think it can be done either way, Mayor, Your Worship, and I think it would be up to the chair, since it was a point of privilege to rule on it.
Point of order.
Okay.
So it's really 6 of 1, half a dozen. The fact of the matter is a motion was put, really, the recommendation was already for approval, so it's not necessarily the case there has to be a motion. We can now have the debate, so at your convenience, Ms. Chair, you can indicate that a motion's on the floor. You don't have to call the question right now because all we're doing is debate. So regardless of but if there is an amendment requested, so we'd have to go and deal with that first. If it's defeated, it goes back to the original recommendation, then we have that discussion again. But regardless, you've now had the motion on the floor, we can have the debate.
All right. So I'm going to suggest that we vote on the amendment first, and then we will debate the development permit as amended. Is there any discussion or debate around the amendment before we vote? Councillor Sharps.
Yeah, so I have to agree with Councillor Dumanowski, which doesn't happen often, but I'm struggling to vote on this amendment when we haven't had a debate, because I feel like the amendment in my head is, I'm still not understanding if you know what I mean? Like the amendment, I think we need the debate before I can agree to this amendment.
All right. It seems like we have a few people. All right. The development permit is on the table, as is a motion to amend it as recommended. Councillor Dumanowski.
So, Your Worship, I'm not trying to be argumentative, and Councillor Sharps and I agree far more than she's willing to admit today, but the fact that the matter was here and we had a non-statutory public hearing means it was on the floor. So the debate should occur first, the conversation, and then a vote. I'm going to stand by that. But my comments are somewhat varied, but I start off by saying, as I've said many times before, when I make these decisions, I make them without emotion. I try to, and I make them, meaning I don't allow myself to be persuaded by emotion from both the applicant or the applicant being the city or those who spoke in opposition. I use the facts, the evidence, the information, be the guiding factor. And for me, it's unequivocal. And I say that in advance because I don't want in any way, shape, or form suggest that the origin or the applicant for this development has any desire but to add to a neighborhood, and it sounded like it was evidenced in a comment earlier that it would be for himself or his family, but I can't allow myself to be persuaded by that. So my comments are such. So my concern is that we have a slope stability and setback report that was authored. Took considerable time. I can't remember exactly, but it seems to me it was at least a couple of years in the making at the time. It was authored by the best engineering practices at the time, understanding slope stability, et cetera. And yet, here we are, 8 years later, challenging its very essence. Not to, a significant extent, and I know the rebuttal to that is, but they did a much more detailed engineering slope stability assessment. My comment within that is that it seems to me, and I know I have engineers in the family, and I have friends who are engineers, and I mean nothing against the engineering profession, but it's what we know today and what we didn't know yesterday. And it's evolving science, and what I, believe it or not, come to appreciate as much or more than that is the comments that we heard from our speakers who said, I've lived here, I've observed it in my 51 years of living mostly in Medicine Hat up to the majority of my life. And I've seen slope instability occur across the city. Now, that's not an engineer's take or response, and some might even say is ignorant. But it's been observed. Anyone who's lived here, I've seen sloughing occur, I've seen erosion occur, and what we've come to know through headlines, whether it be in neighboring communities or elsewhere, is that the engineering practices of that day, based on those understandings at that time, came back to haunt both the owner and the municipality. And so I'm not trying to be dramatic, but I believe we have 9 people here, or 8, who will make a determination for the next 100 years, just like these neighbors up here indicated their homes are well over a century old. So for me, we have regardless of who's engineering detailed, or details are more, are authored with more accuracy. They are authored based on what they know today. And I firmly believe we have an opportunity to make, I'm going to call it the right decision. We want to encourage development, and I certainly would love the applicant to build this home, but not here in the city. And my concern is that we have an opportunity, and our view, our lens right now is a little bit disguised or distorted by the fact that we see these side views and right side views and topographical views of this house and development on a piece of land, but we don't take into consideration the future aspects of stability. And I'm concerned by that. Again, not an engineer, but I'm concerned. We had a report. That entire report then should be thrown out today, because it essentially says what the engineers at that time identified as slope stability and setbacks no longer are valid, or are only valid until someone else is willing to author a different opinion. And that to me creates concern. So I look at all these, we talked about restrictive covenants, and that's not new. I couldn't say it earlier, but that's not new terminology to me, and I understand that, and I understand we can add it, but a lot of the comments have been made. How do you monitor, how do you safeguard against that? When I look at even the letter that's in here about creating stability, it talks about upper portion setbacks and crusts and no fill and no steepening of slope, and construction will, within their own report, they're talking about all these conditions that they are going to have to do and meet in order for it to be perfectly fitting the GEO report and their new findings. And that to me is at the crutch of the matter here, and that is that how in God's green earth are all those things going to be met? I'm just a realist. There's no way. Over time, they're not going to be. I'm not saying the applicant won't, but at some point it won't. So when I talk, and there's within our report or some of our things, we talk about downspouts, and that's a normal thing. We talk about sprinkler systems and where the water will run off, et cetera. The difference is on my property in Taylor, if I overwater and I go away for a week and I keep my irrigation on, there's going to be water. It's going to go down the alley. It's going to go down the road. But it's not going to create havoc or wreak havoc on a neighborhood, other than it might flow into a neighbor's property, in which case I'm sure I will hear about it. But in this case, we're asking for every condition to be perfectly met over the next 5, 10, 50, 100 years in order to mitigate any or further any slope instability. And to me, those are just, we're just asking for trouble. We're asking for a future council in the future, and a solicitor and an engineer at the time to say, what were those folks thinking? And so I can get into more of a scientific basis from the Councillor Dumanowski's perspective, why I'm opposed to it, but practically speaking, it just makes good sense to make the decision now so that we mitigate the concerns for, in my opinion, the applicant, the neighboring community, and the city in the future. So I'm opposed.
I just have a clarifying question because I must have misheard something. My understanding was that the GEM testing limited report the site-specific slope stability assessment was in fact in compliance with our EBA 2014 study.
I thought I heard, and maybe Mr. Sissons, I love to be corrected if I'm wrong. It rarely happens, but please do it today. I thought I heard it was outside, but it was a, I don't know what the wording you used, it was a more detailed analysis that basically changed the setbacks. Is that what I heard, or did I hear that wrong?
Through your worship to Councillor Dumanowski, there's kind of two parts to this. The EBA report is the starting kind of guideline document that outlines where our general slope setbacks are. As part of that document and the recommendations, a new slope setback can be established by a geotechnical engineer who completes a slope assessment report and provides that recommendation. The slope setbacks themselves are in specific locations. However, in this specific location as well, they did move forward with doing a site-specific slope setback. So the report is in compliance with the EBA report, and to that point, does align with kind of our best practices and the report itself.
Just so I'm clear, Your Worship. So does that mean that the setbacks didn't change? The original setbacks are true? They're not. That's what I thought I heard.
To Councillor Dumanowski, the original setbacks are, again, kind of a guideline or a starting point, and that's why we do require, in circumstances when a developer or anyone wants to build outside of them, to do a site-specific to ensure that they're actually accounting for the actual condition and constraints of that specific parcel. The EBA report is based on a series of cross-sections, and there's a lot of assumptions and interpolation that took place in order to establish what that setback is. And that's why, as part of that report, a recommendation is, if you're wanting to build within that slope setback, that you establish and reassess if that slope setback is correct or if a new one can be established.
Councillor Knodel.
Thanks, Mayor Clark. Through the chair. So our responsibility in this position is to make decisions for the greatest positive impact on the municipality as a whole. So right now I'm observing great evidence that says that this is a good idea, and I'm also observing a community on 11th Street saying that they are concerned. Despite the evidence, they don't know for sure. I understand good technical data can give us peace of mind, but there's no guarantees, and there's evidence that's making me concerned about the future. So I grew up doing gymnastics at Salta. It's just on the edge of the coulee on the west side, southwest side of the highway, and we spent many days running down the edge of the coulee and doing training in the park and then coming back up, and now there's signs on the edge of the coulee saying that you can't trek there. The same thing goes for the green space on the other side of the highway. Spent many years scaling the sides of the cliffs, and now you can't do that. So being that we as a group have placed priority on environmental preservation and social responsibility in the strat plan, I have concerns about the long-term impact. It's a challenging decision because I'm a huge proponent of growth. I love the modern design of the home, and I'm so thankful for the work that this developer does in our community. Overall, my instinct is to vote against the project. It's not an easy decision. I have given you the evidence as to why that is, but that's my decision.
Councillor Sharps.
Thank you. Through the chair. So a couple of things. First of all, I agree with everybody about the developer. The developer that's proposing this is obviously a huge impact in our community, and I love the work that he does, and I'm grateful for that beautiful house, but I have to agree, I don't think that's the right area. As I go through this and I'm looking, and I'm going to give you a scenario. So I live in Vista, And I have a house that has one of those concrete fences, and it's one of those beautiful solid rock fences. And it doesn't require a retaining wall because it's 6 inches thick, and so it's just gorgeous. It's on the corner. And my neighbor behind me about 5-6 years ago had an engineer come over, and nothing against our engineers because I think they're amazing, but had an engineer come over and gave him a report on his side that he could put lawn up to with, as long as it was a very light peat moss and it would not impact mine. So here we are a few years later, and I've got $10,000 worth of damage to one panel. At no time did that engineer come to my side of the wall and look at my side. So when I hear the people in the gallery, I absolutely, when I read this, you know, over the weekend, the very first thing I thought is, well, where are their reports? I would like to see all of those reports, because I think if somebody would have done that at my house, and obviously it's not the same impact, it's just one little cement wall, but it's a couple of $10,000 to me. So I go, what, you know, if that guy would have just walked across, maybe we could have stopped this, and I wouldn't be out so much money and be so frustrated with my neighbors. And so I'm hoping that if we, as it stands, I cannot support this, but if there is an argument to support that there is no impact to the neighborhood and that's really, there's engineering that will go actually give those answers on their properties, then I'd be willing to hear it. But the way it stands right now, I could not support this.
Just a point of procedure. Can you please explain to council what happens if this development permit is denied?
So through your worship, if this permit was refused, there would be basically a hold placed on any future applications that were essentially a similar nature for 6 months. After that, the applicant could reapply. Or if the application has changed substantially, they could be considered for reapplication.
Thank you. Councillor Hirsch?
You're right. The applicant is making a lot with a very nice view. Certainly, there is a reason why he wants to do it. I'm not really focusing as much on the applicant, but interestingly enough, we do be fortunate to be living in a city where we know a lot about different people. And funny enough, it does give me some comfort knowing the reputational risk that the applicant's taking on. It's not like he's a dentist or a lawyer or whatever else. This is a gentleman that does the business. So the fact of the matter is that he's willing to put his reputation on this gives me some comfort. I just kind of want to go through factually in terms of my mind. Councillor Sharps indicated that your neighbor who's adjacent to you made a material change. We're talking, and that's why I asked about the addresses, is that realistically they are a certain distance away from the development. In my mind, you actually have more concern of a neighbor that's building right next to you with a heavy equipment, doing a foundation, et cetera, than you would a person 100 meters away. So I'm not necessarily going to buy the argument. However, I do understand anyone that makes a major purchase of your house is rightly and absolutely has the right to be concerned on what's going on in their neighborhood. So I will give it that. As far as the geotech goes, I did have a conversation with Councillor Dumanowski just to confirm that both reports were of the same liking. And the fact of the matter that the geotech on the specific one does indicate that, again, there's a reason why they're stamped. And that individual, and I deal with this in my day job all the time, is that we rely on the professionals in the industry to make sure that what we're doing is within practice, within code, within safety, and I'm willing to accept that as it's presented. The fact of the matter is that I don't know if we would have this discussion if there wasn't an existing house on that lot. It would probably be, but precedence has been set, and I'm comfortable with that. There was a question in regards to just the whole list of stuff that has to be done within the development. Well, quite frankly, that all work done on a development has to be inspected, has to be checked, has to be reviewed before substantial completion certificates be an issue, which means the house is fit to be inhabited. So there is going to be the checks and the rechecks, et cetera. That's why I went back to my comment of, is there anything that the homeowner could do that could have a negative effect on the property, to which the answer was no. So any development going forward, swimming pool, any building, et cetera, has to go through a development permit. So we will get any type of future development that ever comes will come to MPC or come to the planning officer for their decision. So that checks a box for me as well. And again, I just want to reiterate that we're not talking about adjacent properties. This is a standalone by itself, and that does give me some comfort as well. And for that, I'll be in support. Thank you.
Councillor McGrogan.
Thank you. Through the chair, being a member of MPC, I've obviously looked at this report several times. I'm very comfortable with the report and the amount of work and the rigor that went into it. I don't think we can discount it because they had pictures of the house in there. I think there was a very thorough job done on kind of presenting the facts to council to make a decision. So I am concerned about the 100-year-old homes in the neighborhood. And I can say that I went through a similar issue down in Harlow where I live, where I had a berm placed behind my residence, and it was very disruptive to our home, and glasses shaking and what have you not. And they were monitoring the vibrations through that time, and I don't know if that type of thing has been considered or is available, but and then these houses that are in question are quite some distance, I think, from the actual residence and the construction. I think it's a positive thing. I can't discount engineers' reports because there's a little bit of differences between an older one and a new one. And basically, they're saying that the stability is there, that that it's not going to cause a major disruption as far as the foundation being taken out of the old house, the new one put in. I'm gonna support the application. Thank you.
Seeing no further speakers, we've heard definitely some concerns about the slope stability, and absolutely no one wants to be in a situation where they are concerned that their home, their place of security and safety, is at risk in any way. I am not qualified to question an engineering report, and that's what evidence we have in front of us. I am concerned about the conditions not being as complete and detailed as we might like, but ultimately, as a counselor, a lawyer, I don't feel that it's, within my area of expertise to question an engineering report. So I also feel like this development is in line with Council's strategic plan to encourage infill development. I will not be supporting the development permit as is, but certainly would with the requested amendment. Although I do not think it's as specific as I would have liked. I do trust our administration to ensure that the development doesn't impact the slope or the surrounding neighbors. And I also am somewhat informed by the fact that I I don't think someone would spend, I can't even guess how much that home would cost, but if they believed that there was a chance that it would slip off the hill. So those are my comments, and so I guess if there are no further comments, I would, oh, Councillor Van Dyke.
Yes, sorry. I was debating if I should say anything or not, but again, I'm not a geologist or an engineer, but I am a longtime resident of the community and have watched the gradual erosion of the coulees over the years. And just for a little context, in the smallest area, well, it's not actually even the smallest, but in one portion where it's 2.1 meters, that's only 7 inches taller than I am, of me laying down on the ground to the edge of the slope. And again, while there might not be a risk from sloughing or slippage, I am very concerned about erosion over time. And the decision in the future being questioned, as both people in the gallery and in the horseshoe have said, what were they thinking in allowing a development to go forward when we know that the coulees are sand and that they do erode over time, and allowing a major expensive development in such a small piece of land. So anyways, that's my main concern.
Through the chair, I just again am going to commend the administration and city staff for all their due diligence with this potential development. Obviously, that's touched many people's hearts and their lifestyles, and I appreciate you coming out this evening to voice your concerns. And I do echo the words of Mayor Clark about infield development, and I appreciate everyone's time, and I appreciate the people that do stick their neck out in our community as developers to take opportunities to enhance and better our community. So thank you.
We have a motion on the table, which has been seconded. We're voting just on the amendment. That passes. And are there, in light of the motion passing, are there any other questions, comments, or debate with respect to the development permit as amended? All right, we will vote. The vote is 4-4. In such cases, the development permit is defeated. Seeing no further business, this meeting is adjourned.